Until the pandemic came and hit us, I think a lot of people were not quite so aware as to how much our lives are impacted by global events that might start anywhere.
This is a real crisis.
I mean, it's been clear that this was likely to spread in the U.S.
We need to be thinking much more ambitiously.
Climate finance is a very big issue.
We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
CGD came about because it was time to focus not only on what developing countries should do, but much more on what the rich world should do.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
Some of our previous work has helped to come up with a kind of innovative financing mechanism that was used to help launch pneumococcal vaccines. We really have researchers and experts here at CGD who come at these issues from multiple vantage points, and I think that's just what helps make our research more rigorous, more rich, and actually more connected to the realities that decision makers are grappling with.
We've been looking to CGD for all of your research and analysis to guide us.
So CGD is nonpartisan. Because of that, over the years, that credibility has given us significant convening power.
Our government highly values the work.
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
Every single time that we're able to get it right, it means we're reducing significant poverty.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time. Greetings and welcome to the Center for Global Development. Today we have an exciting morning here in DC, an exciting morning of conversations around the future of development, the future of development cooperation, and the role of the organizations that are organized to support the development process. We have three panels that are going to be coming up shortly. First one will be moderated by Charles Kenny, and that will look at how we think about development today, how that has changed. That'll be followed by a second panel that will be moderated by Michaela Gavas. And Michaela and her panel will talk about how the role of development cooperation agencies has changed in response to the way the development concept has itself evolved. And finally, we're going to have a third panel that will be moderated by Clemence Landers. And Clemence and her panel will talk about the role of the multilateral development banks, which have always been an important channel for both finance and advice to developing countries, but their own role is also changing in the light of the evolving global landscape. Before we get to these panels, though, I have the great privilege of having a conversation with Minouche Shafiq, who is the director of the London School of Economics, has a long and distinguished career in public policy, vice president of the World Bank, permanent secretary of the UK's Department for International Development, deputy managing director of the IMF, deputy governor at the Bank of England, and now the LSE, deep thinker about development issues and a long-term friend. So it's a personal privilege for me to be able to host this. Minouche, welcome to CGD.
Well, thank you, Masood, and happy birthday to CGD. 20 is a very honorable and important milestone.
Thank you very much. Minouche, I thought we might start by really focusing a little bit about how the way we think about development, the challenges of development, has changed. You and I were both at the World Bank 25 years ago, and we thought about development and the challenges facing developing countries in a particular way at the time. Now we think about them somewhat differently. How do you think about them differently today?
Well, it's interesting. When you think back when we were at the World Bank together so many years ago, the World Bank was essentially a monopoly supplier of knowledge and finance for developing countries. And knowledge at that time was seen to flow one way, from kind of rich countries knowing what the answers were to poor countries having to implement them. Everything we did was secret. If you remember, every report that was written at the World Bank and the IMF in those days had official secret on it. And it was a very sort of top-down model of how we made progress on development issues. Today it is so different. Today there's a multiplicity of players, there's a multiplicity of financial sources. Developing countries have much greater capacity. Their officials have been to the same top schools that staff at the World Bank or the IMF
like
have
the
been
LSE,
to,
for example.
such as the London School of Economics, exactly. And it is much more of a marketplace for ideas and finance. In many ways, a much more complicated landscape, but a much more open and decentralized landscape for thinking about how to do development.
Would you say that the issues also are different in the sense that 25 years ago, you know, if you go back, think about history of development, they started off essentially as being, well, we think it's a shortage of capital. And then it sort of became, well, we need to have these large projects, infrastructure projects. Then we started thinking about country policies and then institutions. And now we think a lot more about interconnectedness and global problems and global challenges. And how do you see that interplay?
Yeah. So it's interesting. You're right. When in the beginning, it was all about infrastructure and physical capital. And then we had the wave of new thinking around human capital, and education and health gained a lot of prominence in the development debate. And in some ways, the culmination of that was the MDGs. And the Millennial Development Goals were sort of, let's list all the inputs that you need in order to achieve development. When you look at the SDGs now, there are two things that are very different about them. One is that sustainability factors in. And two, they're universal. They're not goals that poor countries need to achieve that developing countries will finance. They're universal goals that all countries should achieve. But what we didn't do is think about goals that are essentially global and need global mechanisms to address them. And that's where the combination of COVID and climate change have forced us to reassess the architecture that we have for delivering development and whether they're adequate to delivering for those kinds of goods which are essentially global. We're no longer in a purely national world in thinking about development.
And so then let's go from the concepts to thinking about how we organize development cooperation, which, as you say, a lot of the agencies were built to operate country by country.
Yeah.
And the nature of the work, whether you were in the World Bank, whether you were in DFID.
Right, it was all country-based.
It was all country-based. There were country programs, you call them country directors, country managers, country
development programs, poverty reduction strategy papers for each country.
By country.
Right.
And so now, if you think about the role of development agencies, so as I say, at the time, DFID was seen as one of the best bilateral development agencies. You and I both worked together at DFID. Of course, no longer exists, but if you were to think of the role of a development agency today, how would you think about its role being different? So the global challenge is certainly one dimension, but are there other things that development agencies need to worry about or think about?
Are you thinking of bilateral development
I'm thinking
agencies?
of bilateral ones first, maybe, because then we can come to the multilateral ones.
Yeah, so I think a modern bilateral agency today would need to focus on several things. First, obviously, every country has national interests or parts of the world where it has historical connections which it needs to support. But how it supports those would be very different than the old model. one of the things that worries me at the moment is that bilateral aid has flatlined in recent years.
Right.
And traditionally, leading donors such as DFID, such as the Nordics, are cutting back. And that is nowhere near being compensated by new donors who are entering the fray. And I think we need to sort of remake the case for bilateral aid. And of course, while arguing for more is good, I think we also need to make the case for greater effectiveness. And I think it's fair to say that there is a part of bilateral aid which is quite inefficiently spent. And so, when we were at DFID together, one of the biggest dilemmas we had was how much do we put through the bilateral aid program versus the multilateral aid program? And I think thinking hard about where is a bilateral program more efficient than a multilateral is really quite an important question these days, especially given scarce resources. I also think that, bilateral aid needs to increasingly be seen as a national investment in global outcomes and global partnerships. And what's my country's share in delivering a better world? And I think that also makes the politics of bilateral aid potentially easier, because you're moving away from we need to help this poor country to we need to partner with these other countries to deliver global outcomes which are in all our interests. And I think reframing the discussion about bilateral aid is quite important.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that if you talk to the leaders of the bilateral aid agencies today, I mean, if I caricature it a bit, 20 years ago, or let's say through to 2010 or 15, there's reasonable clarity about the purpose of what the bilateral aid was supposed to do. Not everybody followed it, but they at least had a fairly clear idea of what they were trying to do. Help countries deal with poverty, deal with health issues, education. And then over the last 5 years, you've started to see, or maybe a little longer, you've started to see bilateral aid being used for a variety of things, for global public good, increasing amounts for humanitarian crises, now in-country refugees. I mean, both Sweden and the UK, I think, will be spending the largest amounts of their bilateral aid this year inside their own countries, financing the first 12 months of the cost of hosting refugees, which is permitted but not required under the rules of how ODA is calculated by DAC. And I think the implication of this is that while 20 years ago people were reasonably confident that they knew how to get the results that they were responsible for delivering, with this venturing into whole new areas, there's much less confidence about how you measure aid effectiveness. So if you get into climate, for example, you're just back from Sharm el-Sheikh, where you were at the COP. Climate financing is taking a much larger share of bilateral aid. I don't get a sense that we have the same degree of confidence about how to get good results with the bilateral aid. I don't know, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. I mean, there is a plethora of activity around climate finance, but very little agreement on norms, standards, indicators of success, impact evaluation. It's an incredibly fragmented landscape. And as you say, when we were working on health or education, there had emerged over the years a set of standards around good practice, how do you measure outcomes, and so on. We don't have that in the case of climate change. We recently had to go use the carbon market at the London School of Economics in order to be certified as net zero. And it's the Wild West, the carbon market. There are no agreed standards about what a carbon offset should look like and how do you measure it and how do you verify it. On adaptation, there are, again, no agreed norms. We don't have good practices out there. And so I do think that there is a huge agenda to be to be focused on in the years ahead around having an international system that delivers climate progress with players, both multilateral and bilateral, who are operating to agreed norms. There is, I myself worked on defining what a green bond is when I was at the Bank of England through the G20 process, but nobody has agreed. The international system has not actually agreed together. There are lots of proposals out there, but we do need some agreed rules of the game. Otherwise, we're all kind of floundering and lots of activity and no real progress.
Yes, and that has both the consequence that people can call something as being effective and when it isn't.
Right.
And it has the other implication that because people don't know whether to trust whatever certification is being put up there, you don't get the support and the momentum behind that new set of things because people are just not confident.
Yeah.
And I feel that a lot of the expertise that the development community has acquired over 30, 40 years in aid effectiveness and then development effectiveness, a lot of that could be used productively, but it requires engaging with the new challenges in a different way than to sort of maybe think of them as being a competitor or something that is outside the remit of the traditional development folk, because I just don't think that's feasible.
And I think it means a different mindset. So we were talking before about how, the traditional development thinking was very country driven. If you're thinking about global problems, you have to start from a different vantage point. And so you have to look at the world and say, where can we achieve mitigation most efficiently for the world? And in which countries does that need to happen? And where are the adaptation costs the greatest? And how do we address those most equitably? And allocate resources on very different criteria than we did when we had a country lens.
Exactly. And so you no longer necessarily have, for this part of the work, country programs that set targets on volumes of, whether you're a bilateral agency or whether you're a multilateral agency, you wouldn't necessarily have a country program.
Exactly.
You would really look at this with a much broader global landscape.
Exactly. And you'd use very different criteria for resource allocation. So, as you know very well, if you look at the way IDA allocates resources at the World Bank, it's essentially around poverty, need, and policy performance. If you were thinking about climate change, you'd be looking at global climate impact and vulnerability as your criteria, which is sort of parallel. Vulnerability is sort of parallel to poverty, need, and climate impact is linked to policy performance. But it's a very different resource allocation mechanism and criteria for success. And we haven't begun to think about that. But I think if we had that sort of framework, we'd be able to mobilize both more resources and more effective resources.
Right. And also more support for what needs to be done.
Definitely.
So we've kind of graduated into I talked about IDA, I think we're into the multilateral system. And there is a lot of energy right now that around the idea that the multilateral development banks need to refocus and make global challenges part of their agenda. And I say part, but there are people who will say that should be their agenda. And there are others who are very unhappy about this by saying this will come at the expense of traditional development work that they do. And I think we're right in the point where these ideas are coming into the marketplace of ideas and there's a discussion going on. I want to get a little bit of your sense of how you see the squaring of this circle, and how if you were to look out the next 10 years, say, let's look at the World Bank as the largest of the MDBs. What could the World Bank do over the next 10 years that would reflect the growing importance of global public goods, of climate in particular, but also pandemic, biodiversity, but not walk away from the unfinished business that still exists in terms of dealing with poverty and improving living standards. How do you think they should approach that?
Well, I think Secretary Yellen's recent speeches struck a balance by saying we don't have a sufficiently good toolkit to deal with global challenges at the speed and scale that we need to. But at the same time, we cannot lose sight of the low-income poverty agenda. And I think you could build a global consensus around those two perspectives. I think everybody thinks we need to invest more in global public goods, whether it's climate or pandemic response or biodiversity, and that requires more resources. And at the same time, it needs to be additional in the context of low-income countries and fragile states who still have huge development needs. And as we know, big parts of adaptation are development finance. It looks an awful lot like traditional development finance.
Well, in fact, you could even make the argument, sorry to interrupt, which is that the best way to prepare countries for adaptation is through development.
Exactly.
Because the richer the countries are, the more capable they are of adapting to the same shock.
Exactly. Exactly. And we've seen that. Why is it that the losses from natural disasters are so far less in rich countries than in poor countries? It's because they're developed and they have infrastructure that's able to cope, and they have insurance markets which are able to cushion people's livelihoods. So completely, those two are completely intertwined. So I don't see it as a trade-off, but I do think that you need additional resources. I also think you need a different kind of financing where you need to look at the cost of capital differently. I think one way to think about it is, if you look at renewables projects, if we care about mitigation and reducing carbon emissions, we don't actually care where those reductions occur from a global perspective. So you want to find the most cost-effective reductions in carbon emissions wherever they are in the world. If you have a renewables project in a rich country, your interest rate is going to be 3-4%. If you're in a poor country, it's going to be 12-14%. So how do you get the cost of capital for emissions reductions in poor countries close to what they are in rich countries? And that's a role for the MDBs, of lowering their cost of capital to help accelerate progress in things like mitigation.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think you go one step further and say the big mistake would be to start setting country or regional targets for mitigation.
Right.
Because you think everybody should have a mitigation
Everyone should
project.
do 20%.
So let's have a solar panel in some school in a low-income country because that's the contribution to mitigation. I mean, the fact of the matter is that some large number of countries, I don't know the exact number, I think it's 48 countries in Africa together account for less than 1% of global emission. There is no plausible development path that would make their emissions globally significant over the next 50 years. And I think, in a way, denying the development agenda, including energy and access and electrification, and including using natural gas for it, just seems to me to be misguided in the sense of it doesn't really do anything for climate.
No.
And it just slows down development.
Completely. And I think, if you look at, let's take mitigation, there are a handful of countries in the world that will determine the global outcome. Best to focus global resources on them. Adaptation, very different story. There are, again, a very different set of countries who are the most vulnerable. And so best to focus adaptation resources on them. The other thing I think that we don't talk enough about is, particularly in the case of Africa, is African countries, many of them are rich in sun, wind, forests, and rivers. And in many ways, they are ripe for a green industrial revolution. And it could be the growth story for Africa in the 21st century if one supported them with a reasonable cost of capital and sufficient investment resources to tap into that natural capacity, including generating income from carbon sinks, which big parts of Central Africa, for example, are, again, in a prime position if we can figure out how to make the carbon market work better.
Right. Before we close, I want to come to one topic which we haven't talked about yet, but which I think is needed for making progress on any of this, and that's really how do we build more trust in the system? Because part of the problem I feel in moving forward on any of these topics is that I do feel there's been a fraying of trust between rich and poor countries, partly because of COVID and vaccines and the way I think the rich world followed up on it or didn't follow up on it. But there's also a lack of trust between major economies. I mean, geopolitics today is much more fraught than it was 20 years ago. How does one find common ground between, say, the US and China and between the G7 and the G77, before you can move forward?
I mean, I think that is the biggest challenge we face today in development, which is we've got all these problems, legacy of COVID, climate, conflict, and war, and a cyclical crisis as a result of rising interest rates and what that's doing to debt sustainability for poor countries. So we've got these big crises, and next year is going to be a really tough year for the world. And yet we've got politics that doesn't help us solve them at all. Both very divided politics within many countries and, of course, between countries. I think those working in the international system and who care about international development need to make a compelling case for why using the system we've got and reforming it and making it better is the most effective way to deal with these global problems. It's essentially an efficiency argument. You've got these problems. If we don't deal with them, we're going to have these calamitous outcomes. And yet, if we deal with them in this way, we could actually make headway on most of them in a pretty cost-effective way. And that means looking quite critically at how we're using current resources, mobilizing some additional resources, and making the efficiency case as to why these are the best ways to do it. And having, citizens in richer countries realize that this is their investment in the global commons. This is not charity. This is, building a world in which we can all collectively live together, both with peace and prosperity. And I think, it's an intellectual case that has to be made. It's also an evidence-based case that has to be made, and something that a place like the Center for Global Development plays a key role in making that case and demonstrating with rigorous evidence why that path of cooperation and collaboration is a better one for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think we have to make the case that the global commons is not some abstract concept. It is what impacts our lives, and it is what will determine the shape of the lives of our children and grandchildren wherever they happen to live in the world. And so the notion that we can still protect ourselves is now increasingly untenable.
Yeah.
With the only way we'll sort it out is by having a global approach. Minouche, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and share this with us. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you. And I want to encourage all of you who have been watching this to stay tuned, because we will now move on to the first panel that Charles Kenny is going to moderate, which is going to be on the future of development. And we're going to have just a break between this and that, but the break is going to be very short, so please stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Masood.
Welcome to the first of 3 sessions on the future of development. The next sessions will focus on multilateral, the role of multilateral development banks and the multilateral community, and on aid in general. We're going to start out a little broader, if you will, thinking about the shape of the global economy over the next 30 years and implications for development. And while the next 2 sessions show that CGD can convene interesting voices from inside and outside, this time in the first session, partially in honor of our 20th anniversary, I want to show that we can convene very interesting voices from inside CGD, from the center and its close friends. We have resident, non-resident, and emeritus fellows alike here joining me today. I'm delighted to introduce Danny Bauer, a non-resident fellow currently at Brown University, Myra Buvanich, senior fellow emeritus at CGD and senior fellow at the UN Foundation, Jide Moore, a senior fellow and the head of CGD's Africa program, Amanda Glassman, the CGD executive vice president, and Justin Sandifer, senior fellow and head of the education program here. Thanks very much all for joining. There are strengthening headwinds, I think, to the global economy and developing country prospects over the next 30 years or so, especially with regard to productivity. I'm going to present some of those issues and then ask the panel to discuss potential fixes to solve the problem in the next hour. We are in the midst of a collapse when it comes to working age population growth in high-income countries. From adding about 6 million potential new workers each year, as recently as 2008, we're now losing 2 million or more potential workers each year from here on out. That's in significant part because of an aging workforce. Just as the number of working age people is declining, we've seen a dramatic rise in the number of dependents. Fewer potential workers directly translates into lower output, obviously, but the effects go far beyond that. An aging and shrinking workforce is a considerable drag on innovation and entrepreneurship, associated with lower firm startup rates and lower patenting. And in upper middle income countries, add in upper middle income countries, and the picture is similar, shifted over a few years and much larger in total scale. By the 2030s, we're going to be losing 10 million potential workers a year, while adding more than 10 million dependents in high and upper middle income countries combined. And these are the countries that account collectively for the great majority of global output. And in particular, they are home to a huge majority of research and development capacity. And they are going to be considerably less dynamic than they were. This is all in a time when we already appear to be struggling to innovate. This picture is from Chad Jones and colleagues. They were asking the question, are good ideas becoming harder to find? The picture suggests a resounding yes, they are. It points out that in a period where the number of people undertaking research and development in the US has increased more than 20-fold, the total factor of productivity in the US and across high-income countries has been heading in the other direction. For low and lower middle income countries, this poses a real challenge. Less global growth means, smaller export markets. It means reduced investment and potentially less ODA. And this at a time when developing countries are having to look for new ways to grow because the traditional route, manufacturing exports, appears to be stalling. This picture shows global value added in manufacturing exports as a percentage of global GDP. Point is, it was higher in 2007 than 10 years later. It seems to have plateaued. That is to say nothing of a range of global threats, from new pandemics through climate change, that are increasingly at the center of global development conversations. The COVID-19 pandemic saw the first increase in global absolute poverty numbers in decades. So what can we do? What can be done to improve prospects for economic development in the world's poorer countries in particular? More productive use of the talents we have, generating more talent through education, finding new ways to use it, are all potential responses that I'm hoping that the panelists will address, alongside better collective responses to global challenges. But before I turn to them and ask a first round of questions, we are hoping very much for input and questions from you all. Do tweet at CGDev, at hashtag CGD Talks, pardon me, or email events@cgdev.org, or post comments to the YouTube stream. So, Danny, I want to start with you. The figures I mentioned on declining labor force and rising old age burden, if I'd showed pictures for low-income countries, Africa in particular, obviously they'd look very different. We're still seeing rising working age populations. So that points to a potential fix, which is at the heart of your work around migration. But what is sort of politically and practically possible for imagining more migration to help fix this global workforce imbalance over the next couple of decades? Can we kind of reach the scale we need to make it a really big part of the answer?
Yeah, well, good question to start the morning. A small one. So but thank you for hosting this and for letting me participate. I'm thrilled to share the stage with all the distinguished colleagues. Charles, one of the things that that it's still crazy to think about today, and to think about that might still be the case in 30 years in the future. Is that one of the better predictors about whether you're rich or poor has to do with where do you live, right? If I take a bunch of fancy methods and I take a bunch of metrics of each person and their experience and years of schooling and every possible square of that and the interactions and everything that you want to add to a regression, and then you add also like where do you live? The where do you live will explain a lot of the variation on whether you as a person are rich or poor. So this is just to say, like, if I know you live in the US, I can guess pretty good in a pretty good way that you're rich. If you live in Tanzania, I can guess that you're probably poor in the global income stage. And that is crazy to think about because, we hear about migration every day. We hear about, in the news and from the voices of politicians all over. But migration is still a pretty tiny phenomenon. About 3.5% of the world population lives in a country other than the one they were born in. So if you compare this to other flows like trade and capital, those other flows are off the charts. They're like 60-70% of GDP or more, depends how if you take imports plus exports or just exports, etc. When it comes to migration, it has stayed pretty much flat over the past decades. Since we have like good measures of migration. So in that sense, kind of the first question, I take your first question and I link it to development, which is like, obviously, perhaps it will be really crazy to think that in 30 years from now, this will still be the rule. That the inability to move from one country to another is still defining essentially your whole future and your ability to reach your full potential. And that takes us to your second question, to your question, because of course, when you have these disparities in terms of the population who can work between developed and developing countries, it's something we're living on today. It's a situation we're living in today. Like the U.S., you probably saw the news over the past month and a half. There were like 100,000 Venezuelans refugees who tried to enter the US. Many of them went in, and then suddenly the administration enacted what is called Title 42, so to keep them away from entering. And then you had people from both sides of the aisle, right? So you have the governors of Texas and Arizona and Florida sending these immigrants kind of as a punishment to states in the Northeast. And then you have the Democrats in the Northeast, like the mayor of New York comes out and says, we have a crisis because 10,000 people just entered the city. Whereas 10,000 people is maybe what you would see by mistake if you just count the number of people in Times Square at noon. So the crisis this country has, and I think I think the US now is kind of at the frontier of that, but you will see it in many other countries, in European countries, in Japan, for instance, is a crisis of labor shortage. That's the crisis. Migration is not the crisis. Migration, if anything, is the solution. So, of course, connecting these dots sounds like very obvious, but it seems we haven't been able to pass on that message to the policymakers for some reason. And as long as we see these distortions, if there's no real way to tackle these distortions, we are going to see this problem getting worse and worse. Of course, the only solution is like, let's think of a way of a global management way in which we can actually build on the labor force of certain countries to deal with the shortages of these other countries. And in that same way, we're really destroying this distortion that we have, that wherever you live is going to define what your income is. We're killing essentially two birds with one stone. We're actually letting two birds live with one stone. And for that, and with this, I'm just going to finish with just one last reflection. For that, the one thing that seems like it's missing in the world, it's a global set of rules that can deal with these issues in the same way that you have a global set of rules that deal with trade issues, which is called the WTO, or we have a global set of rules that can deal with capital flows issues. But we don't have a global set of rules for migration issues. We have some attempt, perhaps non-binding, of certain countries saying, yeah, maybe it's a good idea to talk about migration, but when it comes, when push comes to shove, there's really not a lot of coordination. So what would it take us in the next 30 years to really, get our act together and to think, how do we set up a global set of rules that really help us regulate the migration flows in a way that everybody's benefiting, to get these trillions of dollars that Michael Clemens talks about in his paper in a few years back, of this $1 trillion on the sidewalks. I think that's the big challenge, how to institutionalize these flows in a way that it really creates win-win-win situations.
Thank you. I feel there's a sort of analogy with what we've been seeing recently in climate, that, for years, scientists, others have been warning that climate change was going to be upon us soon. And, now Pakistan floods and so on, by golly, yes. For years, people like you, Danny, have been warning us that there was going to be this sort of imbalance. We were going to need migration to fix this problem, and we're just seeing it in labour markets at the moment. I wonder whether we will be more successful in creating strong global institutions around migration than we have been in creating strong global institutions around climate. Perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion. But Mara, I want to move to you next, if I may, which is, I mentioned sort of this, that some of the numbers on innovation and the fact that it seems to be slowing down, and rates of new business startup are slowing down, at least in rich countries and so on, or at least until very recently with a slight uptick during the pandemic. This, of course, links to a huge gender imbalance. Worldwide, we've seen women, catching up, in some cases overtaking when it comes to education levels. The number of women in college in the United States, I think, is now millions more than the number of men in college, but that's a part of a worldwide phenomenon. But when it comes to innovation worldwide, we're still seeing these immense gaps, so that women account for perhaps sort of 10% of patent authorships worldwide, and less than 1 in 5 formal enterprises is run by women. How do we close that gender gap in innovation? And not just because it's sort of the right thing to do, but also because, you know, it's going to be a hugely important part of a story of trying to reverse this slowdown in productivity.
Thanks, Charles, for the question, and thanks, Danny, for your comments. I think you debunked some myths on migration, and I just want to maybe add and debunk some other myths. But first, you know, sort of some good news for you, Charles, and all of us. I mean, if we are concerned about a shrinking labor force, a very simple answer is to just get more women into it. Women account now for 39% of the global workforce. If they participated at the same rate as men, you would add immediately 240 million women to the workforce and 28 trillion global annual to GDP globally. So, but a more nuanced answer, I think, is to expand the structure of opportunities for women entrepreneurs and for young women. And I will say, especially in developing countries, because they are a potential source of underutilized and unutilized labor. Almost half of all early stage entrepreneurs in the world are women, according to reports from the Global Enterprise Monitor 2020, while 1/3 of established businesses are managed by women. Low-income countries, in fact, show higher rates of female early stage entrepreneurship than high-income countries. Women entrepreneurs represent about 1 in 3 growth-oriented entrepreneurs active in the world today. In Indonesia, for instance, more women own or manage high-growth businesses than men. And globally, women entrepreneurs are almost as likely as men entrepreneurs to offer innovative products and services. The only catch is that early stage ICT and telecom-based enterprises are dominated by men. And these are the ones that are favored by angel investors and venture capital. So first, investing in the growth of women businesses, especially in low-income countries, makes sense. It will unleash underutilized talent, and it's not rocket science. As you know, basically these firms, what they do require, the basic constraint to growth of these firms is women-friendly financial services and capital. And as research that we have done here at CGD in Indonesia shows, that giving women access to financial services and business training really works. It increases women's profits, the personal agency, and household income. And a growing international movement actually seeks to make sex disaggregated financial services data, both supply side and demand side, a basic first step in getting financial sector providers to recognize the opportunity and serve the women's market. Gender data tracks performance and provides a business case. Interestingly, gender champions among financial sector regulators and banks are moving the needle, and some of the countries and regulators leading the way in collecting and using this data to eliminate bias against women in the financial sector are not in the global north. They are in the global south, appending the notions that progressive policies for women always start in the north. A second priority, obviously, is to provide incentives for young women to join STEM disciplines and remove biases against women in STEM instruction. As a recent report from my colleagues at CGD points out very well, widespread discrimination dampens the benefit of girls' schooling, and there is a need to combat gender bias in schools. And this is especially so for STEM instruction. Again, this is not rocket science. As you were saying, you know, that the big issue that there's more girls in school and achieving higher levels of education than boys. Well, this is not only in developed countries. This is not in the global north. This is globally, actually. In 2020, 43% of young women and 37% of young men globally were enrolled in tertiary education. India, that is an extreme example of a shrinking women's labor force over time, where the labor force has gone down, in fact, has the opposite trend in terms of women's education. Young women have higher education than young men. Young women, therefore, are better trained, more prepared than young men, but have fewer economic opportunities than them. And this is worldwide. It's not only a phenomenon of the North. What can we do? Active labor market policies, including boosting youth skills through training and mentorships, providing incentives to training providers and employers, work well for young women. In fact, in many instances, they work better for young women than they work for young men. So investing in active labor market policies can unleash the growth of talent and break intergenerational cycles of discrimination. These policies, however, have to be paired with providing young women with full access to quality reproductive health services. As Nancy Birdsall, the CGD's founder and former president, has eloquently written in an episode series that is in the CGD webpage, reproductive rights are central to young women's economic empowerment. Again, these policies are not rocket science, nor are they unaffordable. I will end, however, with not so good news. There's a strong backlash against policies that seek to empower women economically and expand their opportunities. Backlash is nothing new in this field, but in contrast to past decades, this time it is well-funded anti-gender backlash. A report from the Global Philanthropy Project shows that over 5 years, between 2013 and 2017, progressive funding worldwide received $1.2 billion, while the anti-gender movement received $3.7 billion, more than 3 times the progressive funding. So there's a considerable potential, I think, to counter the demographic drag in innovation by investing in expanding the economic opportunities of women entrepreneurs and young women in the global south in particular, provided, however, that progressive philanthropy raises to the challenge and that gender-smart public policies are well-funded and sustained. Thank you.
Thank you, Myra. You point out how far beyond what usually people think of as being empowerment, how much further we have to go. You know, it's beyond schooling, it's about training, it's beyond thinking just about economic rights. It's about broader human rights, including access to maternal health products and so on. I'd like to come back to that. I'd also like to come back to the link between migration and gender. You mentioned, and I should have mentioned, that there is this big gender gap in the workforce that translates into a big gender gap in the global workforce. And so more of the people who could help fix this global imbalance in workers are women than are men, and so it's definitely a gendered issue. And I'd love to come back to how we promote women's migration in particular during the discussion. Justin, we talked a bit, and Myra talked a bit about skills gaps and the role for education and education outside school in particular in sort of fixing some of these gaps in gender inequalities. Obviously, also really important in innovation more broadly, and very important in particular to better quality of services provision, I think, which is, as you know, more than 2/3 of the global economy. Pretty much any solution to the global growth slowdown then is going to have education fairly front and center. But looking at your work and the work of your colleagues at CGD suggests a somewhat mixed picture. I mean, on the one hand, as we all know, rapidly increasing enrollments, real success in getting more bums on seats, more kids in school, women and girls, girls and boys alike. But at the same time, the work you've done on the quality of education, or at least some measures of the quality of the education, learning outcomes, suggests a not quite so happy picture. Indeed, in many places where enrollments have increased the fastest, we've also seen some of the fastest declines in quality, and test scores, average test scores dropping really fast. How big a problem is that? And is it fixable over the next 3 decades?
Thanks, Charles. As Danny said, just small questions to fight off here. So, yeah, just to reiterate, I mean, I think anybody who's paying any attention to kind of a global education conversation, if they know 2 things, it's the 2 things you said, which is that the amount of schooling around the world has been exploding. I was playing with the numbers last night. Ghana today has more average years of schooling than the UK did when Ghana got independence from the UK. And the same goes for Cote d'Ivoire and France, So developing countries stand ahead, in terms of schooling levels, most developing countries ahead of where Europe was when my parents were going to school. But not in terms of income. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire had about 25% of the income of where their former colonial rulers were even 50 years ago. So, but schooling levels have burgeoned. And the other thing people would know is that learning levels are quite low. And there's a lot of fretting about that in the global education and the aid community, that learning levels are low. And a small proportion of, West Africa, which I just focused on, is a great example where you've got, countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, even Ghana, where people making it through the schooling system, coming out as adults with several years of primary schooling, have only like a 25% literacy rate. So we've got real school quality issues. And what our work has showed, as you said, is that that's not that we've been making gradual progress and we're improving school quality in much of the developing world, and we need to kind of continue the trajectory. That quality metric has actually been declining. The likelihood that you're literate after a certain number of years of schooling is on the downhill trajectory for most of sub-Saharan Africa and most of South Asia, even as numbers of people going to school have exploded. So, I mean, there's no real way to spin that as great news. There's definitely a quality issue to be addressed there. I guess I have 2 sort of hopeful things to say. One is that I think there's reason to believe we could expect those trends to pick up in terms of school quality. Now, it's definitely the case that, when we looked back through this data, trying to look for examples of countries where you've seen a rapid improvement in school quality, that they've done some reform to dramatically improve learning levels. And they just don't really exist in the aggregate data. So I don't think this is something that's going to be, fixed in the course of a decade. And Ghana is not going to become one of the higher performing, sub-Saharan African countries, Kenya, in the course of the next 10 years. There's no real precedent for that. But we also just don't have experiences of countries trying to educate so many people at such low levels of income. And I think it's reasonable to expect that as state capacity increases, as incomes go up, that the quality of the schools will follow to some extent. And so we should be happy overall that, the net effect of all this expansion in schooling, even with some deterioration in quality, is that we live in the most literate time in world history, right? We've never had so many people so literate. The net effect of all this schooling has been huge and positive. So great news on that front. And I expect that trend to continue rising. The other thing that I would look at, in addition to these test score levels and literacy levels and schooling levels, is to talk about the returns to schooling. Now, we want the returns to schooling to fall, right? I mean, we talk about returns to schooling being a good thing, but it's just a measure of inequality, right? We'd like the value of education to go way down. We'd like to educate so many people, it's no longer valuable in the marketplace, and drive down these returns to schooling. We're not achieving that, right? Even in most developing countries, even as the number of people going to school has exploded, we're not driving down the Minserian returns to schooling in a labor market typical regression. So until we do that, we need to keep churning out more and more skilled people. Now, if we did drive down the returns to schooling, there's obviously more than one interpretation. One is that we've oversupplied the market, and the other is that we're just not teaching people anything and we're not providing the right skills. And so I'd be a lot more worried about these skill stories if I saw these returns to just years of schooling going down. But that's so far, I think, not what we're seeing. Now, just to try to provoke a little bit of conversation, in future rounds here, I think two things. Linking this to the migration conversation. I mean, at the end of the day, what we know about measurable skills does little to explain those earnings differentials across countries. Just to reiterate Danny's point. And so I think seeing these as alternatives, we need to have there's interesting conversations to be had about the skill mix of migration. But I think seeing these as alternatives, is really the wrong way to go. And in practice, if we kind of decompose the returns to schooling, the way that most people get an economic return to schooling is moving, right? You go to school in the village so that you can move to the city and get a job. Like education and migration are, intimately intertwined. And then on the gender component, we've seen amazing progress in increasing gender equality in terms of education outcomes. And as Myra mentioned, with girls in many countries surpassing boys in terms of educational performance levels or test score performance. I think the depressing thing is that for the most part, where we've seen convergence in educational performance between girls and boys, that hasn't translated into a huge erosion of income differentials between men and women. We've seen equalization of schooling levels without equalization of labor market outcomes. And so equalizing education, I don't think is, the silver bullet to solving all of our gender disparity problems. Let me stop there.
Depressing on sort of two margins. One, education alone will not work, as Mario was suggesting, as well as you say, to fix the gender gap. And education without the ability to move doesn't help too much either. I'd like to come back to both of those if we have time. I keep on promising to come back to things. We've got some questions in the chat 25 minutes to go, and I haven't even brought Jude or Amanda into the discussion. Clearly, we were very optimistic. Turning to Jude, if I'm right to say that manufacturing, sort of global demand for manufacturers is in some ways peaking, or at least global manufacturing trade is peaking. That's kind of sad news for low and lower middle income countries that might want to follow the model of South Korea and China and so on, in using manufacturing exports as a way to power through to higher incomes. Do you think we should give up on manufacturing? Do you think that for Africa, the manufacturing-led path is the only one to fast growth? If I'd mentioned services in the introduction, services exports, the picture's a bit more positive already in terms of value added. Services exports are nearly as valuable as manufacturing. Or is there another path to helping African countries onto the sort of rapid growth ladder that we'd really like to see?
Yeah, again, it's a pleasure to be here with all of my colleagues. Thanks for having me. I think, the idea that we would take a completely different path, a completely new one that has never existed before, and that is going to be the one on which African economic growth is going to be. I'm a bit skeptical of that. But I think there are significant challenges to the old model. So, for example, recently, because beginning with the Trump administration and the trade war with China, this idea of reshoring and friendshoring has come up in terms of rebalancing global supply chains. It turns out that it's actually benefited Asia significantly more. For example, Bangladesh and Thailand, their exports to the US have gone up by about 80%, Vietnam by about 170%. We've seen no change in African exports to the US or any other markets. And so while we're seeing manufacturing shift from China, it's not coming our way in Africa. Part of that, of course, is the significantly high cost of industrial labor in Africa, but also the cost of infrastructure. And so I think it's going to be all of the above. It's going to be a suite of things. It's going to be parts of the old model. It's going to be parts of the new model. There's been this argument of industries without smokestacks, right? That African economies are going to increasingly, that's what we're going to see. So I think part of it is going to be first in agriculture. We went from 66% of the labor force on the continent being in agriculture in 2000 to 58% in 2015. That's not good enough, right? And so it looks as if for at least for the foreseeable future, maybe another 15, 20 years, agriculture is going to continue to be a big part. And that might be where it first happens, adding value to agricultural products. So I'll give an example with Ethiopia, where making and selling injera, the staple that Ethiopians eat, now employs over 100,000 people. Why? Because instead of making injera at home, people are buying ready-made injera. And as more and more people buy ready-made injera, we have these industries growing up to supply that. So we're seeing that. But the second thing we're seeing also is that, the transition away from subsistence farming to commercial farming. More and more Africans who are involved in agriculture are not doing agriculture on subsistence farms. They're doing it on commercial farms. So, for example, in parts of Ghana and parts of Kenya, we're now seeing fruits and vegetables that are grown, harvested, packaged, cut, and then showing up in the shelves at Tesco or Sainsbury and across Europe. So, again, it's not the classic manufacturing that we think about, say, going into textiles, but it is a combination of that. And then two of our colleagues here at the Center for Global Development, Vij and Alan, did a paper a couple of years ago about, is Africa the next destination for global manufacturing? And one of the things they noticed was just the high cost of industrial labor in Africa. Part of that was the high cost of living. Food was very expensive, and it was contributing to that. And the only country in Africa that came, so they had this number that for an African country to be competitive as a destination for manufacturing, the labor cost had to match Bangladesh. And the only country in Africa that was close to Bangladesh was Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is the one where, all of that now is threatened by the war happening. So I think the pace at which we're able to build an infrastructure in Africa is going to influence the path we take and which one of these becomes dominant. As recently as 2019, 42% of infrastructure in Africa was financed out of African countries' budgets. Well, that number has been thrown out completely because of this past 3 years and the effect that it's had on incomes. So I think Ethiopia presents the best example for what we will see. One, exporting skilled labor to markets where, like immigration, Ethiopia is one of the countries that actually has an entire government ministry that is about creating conditions for Ethiopians to work in places and improving the regulatory environment for sending countries. So I think we're going to see a lot of that, skilled labor leaving the continent, going places to work. We're going to see these smoke industries with our smokestacks. But Ethiopia was also the country online to be closest to the South Asian model in terms of manufacturing and textiles. And so I think what we saw in Ethiopia is sort of a microcosm of what the entire continent is going to look like. The final thing is, if we can increase the amount of trade that happens within Africa and between African countries, that itself might be able to absorb a lot more people in terms of the labor force. So what model? Is it a completely new model? I don't think so. I think it's going to be a combination of everything we've seen before and all of the above. I know that's kind of a cop-out, but that's exactly.
May well be a very accurate cop-out. Thanks. I'm interested by what you say about Ethiopia. It links back to the gender question, not least. I think a fair number of the people working in that the garment industries are women, and I wonder if that's linked. You also mentioned the past 3 years and how they have not been good for infrastructure investment in Africa, amongst other things, and that's where I'd love to bring in Amanda. So, say we actually managed to come up with a suite of solutions, as Jude suggests, probably involving more migration, certainly involving more support for women that own enterprises worldwide, involving better education, new paths to development through services exports. Imagine we achieve all of that, and yet we see repeat pandemics and we see worsening climate change. We probably haven't got anywhere. What is your guess as to how well the world does over the next couple of decades in putting in place the kind of tools and mechanisms we need in order to sort of preserve the global public goods of no pandemics and not runaway climate change, not least? How likely is it that we'll have those kind of fundamentals in place to allow global development to continue?
Another small question. So thanks to my co-panelists. I think what's interesting is that you started this presentation talking about population and the dynamics of population, because that has so much to do with well-being. And if you're a reader of Our World in Data, one of my favorite websites, they have this very long-term look at how the world was really in kind of a Malthusian trap, let's say, for many, many years, until growth combined with technological innovations really enabled this kind of long period of increased growth around the world. And I think the question is whether these new risks, they're not really new, they're old risks, but they're risks that seem to be increasing in frequency and severity, climate risks or pandemic risks, would derail that historical trend that we have seen, a sort of ever increasing growth. And, sometimes when we look at the climate literature, they have this idea of the binding constraints. There's binding constraints to growth that Ricardo Hausmann puts out there, but there's also these idea of tipping points in climate beyond which elements of human life would no longer be sustainable. So are we kind of at a new Malthusian moment? That's, I think, a question for us to think about. I would say, health is very highly correlated with gross domestic product and growth and things like that. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that relationship goes both ways. We saw very big shocks associated with the pandemic and the countermeasures that went alongside. But, if we looked historically, we would say, well, maybe that's a blip, right? It's a significant blip, but then we would be back to trend. So I guess the question is, if it's really the case that pandemics and climate risks are increasing in frequency and severity, are our systems that we have today really fit for purpose? And what are the prospects for developing these kind of global risk sharing and risk protection mechanisms? And as you said, these are global public goods. So we know just at baseline that they're going to be underinvested by national governments, because some of the benefits to responding quickly by curbing emissions or by adopting more expensive but more effective technologies that would limit emissions and or stopping a pandemic, an outbreak before it spreads across countries, that these are likely to be underinvested by governments. So the question is, are we setting up mechanisms that will enable the global community to deliver on the benefits of early control of both of the problems? So far it's kind of mixed bag, some good news, some bad news. Let's just talk about pandemic risks in particular. There is, of course, a huge consensus, which is actually an accomplishment in and of itself, that the response to COVID-19 was inadequate, that there were more economic losses than were necessary, and certainly more deaths than were necessary, and a huge inequity in the availability of medical countermeasures like vaccines in early days. And money was a big part of those bottlenecks that we witnessed. It affected countries' ability to pre-purchase vaccines. It affected countries' ability to even acquire things like personal protective equipment for medical staff. And it affected, of course, the efficiency of the rollout of vaccines and their delivery, and therefore had a role to play in explaining some of the inequities in response. So, everyone agrees we should prepare better for next time, so we avoid the need for a response in the first place. So that's good consensus. And so on the back of that, a new pandemic fund was set up. It was just launched by the G20 yesterday in Indonesia. But so far, although experts have estimated 10 billion a year would be needed, some have estimated more. Colleagues at the University of Chicago, Rachel Glenister, estimated that 60 billion would be needed in upfront costs and 10 billion a year afterwards just for ever-warm vaccine manufacturing. That amount of 10 billion a year is less than 0.0001% of US domestic spending on health. You'd think it would be worth it. But so far, we're just not investing anything near what would be needed to adequately prepare. So, what would be the circumstances under which we would adequately finance this preparedness? We'll have to see. Probably a situation of greater growth in high-income countries has something to do with the willingness to finance prevention. On the climate side, there has been a lot of cooperation. We've seen the COP27 meeting, and I'm very encouraged by the recent financing of South Africa's plans for a just transition with highly concessional lending. I think the question is, what that was kind of an ad hoc effort. And so can we do this more systematically? And some of the ideas that I hope will be discussed in the Multilateral Development Bank reform section may talk about some of these things. But, I think that the other key point to say is all of these risks are nothing if we're not able to maintain the kinds of investments and other interventions that we've talked about on this panel. But, despite Justin calling for, we need to reduce returns for education in the near term, hopefully returns are healthy so that people do have motivation for greater levels of education. Of course, labor market participation by women on equal terms and equal access to innovation and things like that. So I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Amanda. And that links very nicely to some questions that have already come in on the chat. You mentioned this new facility that is not reaching anywhere near the sort of 10 billion we'd need to do the bare minimum when it comes to making sure we have rapidly ramped up vaccine capacity for if and when we go through the last 3 years again. There is sort of this problem, and indeed one of the people asking a question put it in terms of, yes, all very nice technical solutions, but what about the political realities? Pretty much that was the comment we got on almost everything that was said by one person or another. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Adam. In some ways, it's not rocket science, to use your term, Myra. We do kind of actually have some solutions, but there seems to be a real gap between having these solutions and these solutions being implemented. Which, if you will, we've been doing the think bit of a think and do tank. When it comes to the do bit, how do we create the political space? How do we make these things politically palatable? How do we create the space for more migration, which is growing in some countries but is not in others? How do we create the space, perhaps in particular for more women migrating? It's a particular problem for women in some countries who have no right to a passport unless their husband or father says they can get one. How do we create the space for these pandemic facilities? How do we make sure that Africa does work together better as an economy in and of itself, and perhaps make labor more efficient and or cheaper, but also work together more closely to trade with each other? Anybody want to sort of try and tackle that sort of political economy question? don't be chicken.
Well, I can try. I was talking to one of our colleagues used to be here, started this organization called LAMP. And one of the, in the end, I think the best way to tackle the political economic question is, even as we attempt to expand the space in what is allowed, we ought to be able to work within the space as it is provided. So in some places, people are more open to temporary labor movement than they are to permanent ones. And so in the places where temporary labor movement is possible, then let's do more temporary labor movements in those places. So I think it's about being, one is the pragmatism of working within the political space that's provided. The second one is that sending countries can themselves take initiative. On the Lagos to Mombasa podcast, we talked to Dawit from the Ethiopian ministry. It used to be an agency, it became a full ministry that goes out and negotiates and negotiates how Ethiopian migrants are treated when they do travel. And there are very few countries that actually have a government agency that is responsible for doing that. So I think even in the sending countries, if they can begin to take it to that level, that would begin to have an impact. And the final thing is, we have all of these meetings, UN meetings, and there are multiple, every year, all kinds of bilateral conferences between Africa and others, these Africa Plus One conferences. If African governments begin to put that on their list of the demands, that too can begin to shape the environment in which it happens. So again, I always like doing suites. I like a suite of tools.
Danny, you mentioned sort of continuing on this vein. You sort of mentioned it would be nice to have a WTO for migration, if you will. Our colleague Arvind Subramanian just put out a blog, or I can't remember, a short op-ed on the subject of climate and how he kind of given up on the international system solving it. But luckily we were entering a subsidy war and everybody was busy subsidizing their green infrastructure. And that was the real hope, was not through a global institution, but through disparate individual national activities. Could you see the same sort of response for migration, gender? I'd imagine, we are seeing it. You can see more of it. Pandemics, I don't know.
That's a good question, and I think that if you would have asked me like 3 weeks ago, I probably would have nothing to say. But now I have something to say, which is that there might be kind of a market mechanism to really take advantage of this huge arbitrage opportunity, which is huge. And about 2 weeks ago, I met the CEO of a Canadian firm called MobSquad, MOBSQUAD. And all they do, it's fascinating. All they do is that they identify migrants who have a job offer in the US, but they, for some reason, they are not able to get their visa in the US, or H-1B visa. So they tell them, okay, come to Canada. I'll give you a green card, a temporary residence or a permanent residence in Canada, and I'll hire you for my company, MobSquad, and then we'll contract you out to this American company, and you will be doing exactly the same thing that you were supposed to do. And we'll just get a cut of your pay, of your salary, and we'll even give you a credit card, and because we give you the salary, so we can also guarantee your credit card, right? So it's an amazing market solution to a huge arbitrage problem that it's out there. So I don't know how scalable this is, but it was a bit encouraging that you start seeing, even if this is anecdotal, you start seeing this one firm that is really understanding this distortion in the market and taking huge advantage of it. I guess that the Canadian government is actually an investor in this firm, so they're aligned with the idea. I wonder whether we could get into some sort of maybe not a subsidy war, but this understanding that if the countries don't start getting their act together in terms of allowing for a more flexible and demand-driven migration system, you will start seeing more and more firms doing this, because why not? It's really picking up the $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. And maybe that could be a mechanism. So I was like, I had a mind blown when I saw this person like 3 weeks ago, and I wonder if that's perhaps some of the ways that of the avenues that we're going to navigate over the next few years, of seeing more market solutions to this issue.
Charles,
Amanda,
I think Myra had a hand up for a minute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Myra, please.
Sure. Just to agree, I thought for many years that gender issues were a technical issue. They're not. They're political. And, progress is detained because of backlash, and it's political. And that, I think the awareness of that is terribly important. A solution, and the only solution that I've seen over time, is to get good evidence-based data, evidence-based policies, based on, accurate data that counters the myths that have been built against women, or what women, the traditional. So I think ultimately I would go back that a big task that all of us have is to build the evidence base and to see that evidence is translated into policy. Thank you.
Thank you. More think tank needed, definitely. Amanda, I need to ask you a direct question from Jenny Becker that came through. You have 1 minute and 30 seconds to answer it. It is basically, is the problem of pandemic response capitalism? The competition based on scarcity has not worked to deliver solutions, so do we need a new system?
No, I think the answer to that is no. But then I am a technocrat that works here at the Center for Global Development. I think, all of the problems that occurred were eminently solvable within our existing systems. I mean, there are many aspects of the system as it operates today that require attention and reform. But, if we look just narrowly at pandemic, it really was the case that, middle income countries didn't have the budget structures themselves and didn't have access to the kind of liquidity necessary to pre-purchase vaccines that were not yet approved by health authorities, right? So it really was just a question of, will I take this risk amidst so much uncertainty, even knowing that it was completely worth it? Even if we had failed, it would have been a worthy investment because of the chance that we would experience what we did with COVID-19. Now, I would also remind us that COVID-19 was a 1% case fatality rate in its worst expressions. Imagine if we have pandemic flu, and there's a non-negligible probability every single year that we have a pandemic flu. What are we prepared to, gin up the vaccine manufacturing? Do we have the money in place to do it? And it's not really a question of whether we have the money. The money is around in the international system. It's about it has to be someone's job. So I guess I'm more optimistic that we can fix this, though I recognize that it's currently no one's job. Thanks.
Thank you. This is a great link to the next panel with Michaela Gavas, which will now start in a little under a minute because we've run over a bit, which is on global cooperation to respond to the world's most urgent challenges. Surely that is one of them. Thank you, everybody on the panel, very much. And please stay around for the rest of the sessions.
The biggest challenge facing development agencies today is just the pace at which their demands for their work are growing and changing at the same time. Development agency leaders are all struggling to find solutions.
Our interconnectedness means that when there are hiccups, we immediately see how the short-term hiccups play out across the globe, affect us all.
The traditional model of development fails to reflect the reality of this shift.
The development agenda was framed 60 years ago, but since the 1960s it has been somehow overloaded by new objectives.
We have to get a better model for working across the traditional development silos.
The biggest challenge to my agency over the next years is definitely the overall lack of coordination of development finance globally.
The place where the international community comes together to collaborate is in the multinational system. There's no alternative.
We have to get back on track and move forward, even though we have really challenging times. And in order for us to do that, we need to double down investments in human development.
Cooperation on global challenges is in the interests of all countries.
Universities, research institutions, private sector, government, NGOs, when you manage to bring them together in a common objective, then you really make the difference and you can create the spark to have a long-lasting impact.
Our region, our continent, and the multilateral development banks are way too undercapitalized.
We need more than just the ODA money.
The only way you'll get close is by bringing in many other sources of finance. Multilateral and regional and national development banks, the private sector.
I really see a value in partnership in itself.
The whole definition of innovation is not just doing something new, but doing something better. More impact, lower cost.
Development ministers can do a lot. Finance ministers are critical. But this is a global crisis and it needs heads of government to tackle it. So I'd like to see it on the top of world leaders' agendas, no matter where they meet.
Welcome to the second session of our Future of Development Forum. So this session aims to build on the conversation that we've just heard on the future shape of the global landscape and to hear from our panelists about the challenges and opportunities of current and future development cooperation. So the exam question for this session is, how does development cooperation really need to change to get the Sustainable Development Goals back on track? Please do join the conversation. You can submit comments and questions through YouTube or by tweeting at CGDev, #CGD Talks, or you can send them in an email to events@cgdev.org. So I'm delighted to welcome our panelists. We have Karin Jämtin, who joins us from Stockholm. She is the DG of the Swedish International Development Agency. We have Anton Leis Garcia. He joins us from Madrid. Anton is the director of the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation. And we have Alexandre Levesque, who joins us from Ottawa, and he is the Assistant Deputy Minister of Strategic Policy at Global Affairs Canada. But before handing the floor to them, allow me to set the context and make a few points. So it's been said multiple times that we face many intersecting crises with huge socioeconomic and geopolitical consequences. These are crises that are derailing progress that has been made in development over the last 2 decades. The chain of problems, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the devastating effects of climate change and extreme weather, and the lingering repercussions of COVID-19, all of these have fueled inflation and protectionism, global food and energy crises, debt crises in developing countries, humanitarian and refugee crises, and the resurgence of global poverty. Now, these are not random shocks, nor are they the perfect storm in a conventional sense, as in a one-off conjecture of bad events. Instead, we face a confluence of lasting structural insecurities, geopolitical, economic, and existential, each reinforcing the other. We have entered a perfect long storm. So the scope of the required humanitarian, sectoral, macroeconomic interventions continue to be vast, as is the geographic coverage. But the stark reality is that midway through the Agenda 2030, we are further away than ever from achieving the SDGs. Now, former US Treasury Secretary and chair of the CGD board, Larry Summers, he recently warned about the dangers for the international community of not stepping up to support developing countries. He pointed to the mounting risks to the global economy, which will have disproportionate consequences for developing countries and risk further fracturing the cohesion of the global community. I mean, the SDGs themselves frame cooperation and partnership as critical to addressing these challenges. But there are very few signs of the collective response that will be needed to meet them. Development agencies, they continue to be hampered by their current models of development. In essence, resources flowing from north to south, in which short-term national interests and bilateral action are prioritized. They're hampered by their political contexts that constrain and inform their action, and by the political compromises in the use of their development assistance to maintain support for it. And it's within development agencies' arsenal that official development assistance is being deployed to firefight shocks, to tackle borderless threats, to address poverty, inequality, and vulnerability. Yet it is now in crisis. So several countries have announced a significant scaling back in their development aid and a redirection of spending. Aid spending on in-donor refugee costs is expected to exceed an estimated 25% of total ODA. On average, only 1/5 of bilateral ODA is spent on global challenges. And of that 1/5, most of it is currently directed at climate mitigation in middle-income countries, at the cost of development assistance for low-income countries. Despite their comparative advantage in pooling risks and in pooling resources, the share of funds allocated to multilateral organizations has not seen any substantive increase. And on the contrary, some of them have borne the brunt of bilateral aid cuts and the redirection. And so the direction of travel, well, it's less aid, more spent at home, less multilateral, and much more focus on using aid to deter migration, despite the evidence to the contrary. So trust in development cooperation and development institutions is now at an all-time low. And so development cooperation needs to undergo a fundamental shift, a shift away from a binary understanding of development to one where differentiated challenges are understood to be faced and addressed by all parts of the world for shared benefit, whether global or local. So let me now turn to our panelists to get a sense of what your agencies are grappling with and how you are changing the way you think, the way you act, and the way you engage in development in response. Karin, let's start with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michaela, and thank you very much for inviting me to be allowed, I was about to say, to take part in this panel on a topic which is dear to my heart and very pressing to all of us. I, of course, agree with all of the way you paint all of the challenges that we're all in the middle of. As SIDA, we have bilateral work in 37 countries. We work in different sectors, but we also work with a large chunk of our budget directly together with the multilateral system. Our aim, our overarching, the target for our work is to eradicate poverty and deprivation in all of our countries. ODA has to be, now trying to touch upon the question that you posed, or rather elaborate a little bit on it. Development cooperation, ODA, has to be challenged and rethought all the time, always, and especially at this stage of history. To me and to us, ODA will continue to be the most important financial flow in many of the poorest countries. being them LDCs or some of the others. It should remain for us a priority to use it in a smart and efficient way in these settings. In many other countries, but also in the poorest countries, other financial flows are increasingly important for sustainable development and economic growth. The question is, of course, how we as development partners can use ODA, the grant mechanism, to catalyze and mobilize other types of funding streams towards reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, all 17 of them, the green goals, but also the more socially targeted goals. When Sweden takes on the EU presidency, which will be the first semester of next year, and after us, Spain will follow, SIDA will prioritize development financing, the financing for development agenda in a broad sense. So let me come to how we look upon the FFD agenda. We are currently working with a new initiative called the FFD and I. And this is that we would like that we are trying to find a model on how to join the financing for development agenda with institution building. It's based on this, our work is based on the assumption that weak institutions is a fundamental factor or a fundamental hindrance behind the slowness in implementing the FFD agenda. We also engage in the aid effectiveness agenda, taking on the co-chairmanship of GPEDC for 2 years as of from December this year. What we also try to do is try to continue work with our flexible, long-term and programmatic and core support. We've been working in this way for many years, and during COVID, it actually proved that working with core support in programmatic and flexible and long-term way gave our partners a possibility to change the way they work and adapt in very, very difficult situations. Finally, I would like to mention a very concrete cooperation that we have together with our Norwegian neighbors, NORAD, in the sense of working together with the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. We, half a year ago, maybe it's even 1 year ago, we began to start a discussion on exactly the same issue that you have put on the table here, and that is what is actually the role of aid today? What is the role of ODA today? We wanted to explore the changes in the development cooperation landscape and what role development aid can play today. We very rapidly decided that it's not enough to discuss amongst the DAC members, but we wanted to widen the area. And with a little help from you, Michaela, and also others, we started to cooperate and discuss with South Korea, but also with Colombia, Indonesia, and South Africa. Very concrete discussions, trying to discuss issues like how is the change in geopolitical landscape impacting international development cooperation? How can we or will we address global public goods at the same time as addressing poverty reduction? So we're trying to find answer to these questions together with so-called new actors on this arena to get outside of what is the sort of development cooperation club, which is the OECD and DAC. Very much in line with what Remia said in the film, that aid has been very much in the same frame for more or less 60 years. So we're doing very many things and trying to challenge ourselves to work in new ways with new methods and with new partners, but also sticking to methods that we know are important. And that is ownership, and that is localization. And it's also putting the needs and the wills of the ones we're trying to better their lives for in really the driver's seat, which is increasingly challenging as we have all of the challenges that you described, Michaela, also here in Sweden, internally with lowering budgets, but also our own economic challenges. So let's come back to that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karin. That was great. And we're certainly looking forward to Sweden taking over the presidency of the EU, the FFDNI, and also co-chair of the GPEDC. Let's move on to Anton. Yes, the floor is yours, Anton.
Thank you, Michaela. I agree with virtually everything that Karin said, and most of what you said, although I wouldn't be that pessimistic. I think there are other transformations going on. But you are certainly right. We are living a world of overlapping crises. We barely left the triple crisis of the health, social, and economic consequences of COVID-19, and now we are in the middle of another triple crisis: food, energy, and then I would say macroeconomic via inflation and normalization of monetary policy in the US and so on. The good news is that in a way, in development cooperation, we've always lived in crisis, what is probably new is the frequency, the depth, and the overlapping nature of those ones. And I think we probably need to start to think of ourselves as living in a crisis as a new normal. The figures are there. We are reversing poverty decreases over the last 25 years. Last year were the first year where poverty increased after 25 years of constant reduction. Food insecurity, refugees, 103 million over the world. Climate, the last 8 years have been the warmest on record, as we know. And of course, the consequences of these dynamics are not felt equally around the world. And if you look at Africa and the climate crisis, we know Africa is only responsible for 4% of the emissions, but the economic toll on growth every year is about 5 to 15%. So that's a case to work globally and to work with developing countries specifically on some of these challenges. So what are we trying to do as agencies? What are we trying to do here in Spain? But I think all of us. Well, first of all, we're trying to tackle the urgent, but also the important. And I think this has been a humanitarian year for all of us. At IFID, we're a humanitarian agency as well. We had to increase our budget by 50%. We put together an unprecedented response in a country where we were not present as a development agency, Ukraine. We delivered that response, and we did so thanks to budget increases. We did so without detracting any money from any other humanitarian context. Of course, we are proud of that, but it's true that took a percentage of our budgetary increases. But we are also trying to learn how to work on and build greater resilience with our long-term development cooperation, working on the nexus, but also addressing fragility more generally. A good example is, of course, the Sahel, where we are working on security, we are working on peace, we are working on stability, we are working on humanitarian needs. But there are a number of examples where we can work on all these things at once. I'm thinking, for instance, of rural communities and food security. That's good for the environment, it's good for climate change and climate change adaptation, which is the big call that we are receiving from developing countries. It's also good for socioeconomic progress, and it's good actually for stability ultimately. But at the same time, I think we're transforming ourselves. And I think we are moving from an old model of development cooperation that is relying exclusively or focused exclusively on poverty reduction, that was very vertical, donor-recipient, north to south, government to government, and also very much focused on ODA, and in particular on grants. And we are moving towards a new paradigm. We are doing it here, at least. Poverty is, of course, important. And with the reversals on the trends on poverty reduction, it is indeed important, but there are other dimensions. And more we're working on global public goods. The 4 priorities for IFID next year are inclusive growth, and of course, poverty reduction, social cohesion, but also global health. That's a public good. Gender equality, we're a feminist development cooperation. We have a feminist foreign policy. That's indeed very important. That, you can argue, is also a global public good. And of course, climate and the just transition in particular focused on adaptation. And our Prime Minister made an important announcements in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. But we're also moving to a more horizontal way of cooperating. I think we need to listen more. We need to listen more to our clients, to our developing countries, our partner countries. We need to tackle together common challenges. This is no longer about, let me fix your problems, but rather, let's agree on the problems we both face and see how we go about them. And I think we need to realize that development cooperation is a tool, it's also an instrument to tackle broader challenges. And I think, again, I refer to the discussions on 27, on adaptation, on loss and damages, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to involve other actors. This is no longer about governments alone. We need to involve the private sector. We need to involve civil society. And on ODA, we think it is important, and I think we feel ourselves, we think we are a bit like the salmon navigating the river upstream. We are increasing our ODA budgets. This year next year will reach 34, sorry. We are still far from others, including others on this panel, but we are making progress. And I think this is the time to really convey to our public opinions that the challenges we face at home are global, and that we need to tackle these common challenges working with developing countries, that every euro spent on ODA is actually an investment on the well-being also of people at home. ODA will continue to play a role. Last year it was only $179 billion, but it's a stable source. And in periods of economic instability, it's actually crucial for developing countries. But we also need to mobilize other flows, climate finance, capital markets, and of course, very important as well, domestic resource mobilization. And I think a bit of this ODA should actually go to build the tax systems of developing countries so they can mobilize this domestic, or bring about this domestic resource mobilization. What I would disagree a bit with Karen is that we should not forget middle-income countries. Middle-income countries is actually where the vast majority of poverty or poor people in the world live. And if middle-income countries were able to resolve the problems by themselves without any support, including from ODA, those would have been resolved already. Inequalities there, gender gaps are there, climate. Some of these middle-income countries are absolutely fundamental in a global fight against climate change. This is what we are transforming in Spain. We have a new law that is about to be approved by Parliament, where we are embracing cooperation beyond graduation, actually, embracing this concept of development in transition. We need to tackle these global challenges. So let me just, because I think I'm getting too long, but 4 quick challenges that I think we're grappling with to sort of feed the discussion. Number one, we need to do, all of us, more with, in our case, a little more, but in some cases less, given the pressure on ODA budgets. We need to try to increase the resources, but also be smarter. And by the way, push the agenda of development effectiveness. It somehow looks like an old legacy of the past, but it is indeed as important as ever, because development aid is as fragmented as it had ever been in the past. Second, this tension we have between the humanitarian and the long term, we have the risk of becoming firemen. And part of what we do is to put away fires, but we really need to take care of the wood better and create that resilience so we have less fires in the future as well. The geopolitical context, number 3, it's complicated. We all know it. We cannot be naive. We operate in political environments. We are political entities. We are channeling the solidarity of our people. So we are using taxpayer money. And we also know that developing countries, our partner countries, have other alternatives. And that's fine. And we need to be mindful of that. But again, I think we need to convey the message that our interests and our values, solidarity in this case, are more aligned than ever before. Like, we need to fight climate change at home, but also abroad with development cooperation. If we have a feminist agenda at home, we also need to project it with our partner countries. And fourth, I think the development world is becoming more complex. Again, let's don't forget about the development effectiveness agenda. Aid is more fragmented than ever. A few days ago, I read this paper by the World Bank. We had 47 donors 20 years ago between bilateral agencies and multilateral institutions. Now it's about 70. And that's a complexity that our partner countries need to navigate. And only $1 out of $4 managed in development cooperation is actually managed by recipient governments themselves, which is difficult to reconcile with the alignment agenda. So the conclusion is, indeed, we're in a time of crisis, overlapping crisis, but I think there is hope because we are people that are used to crisis. That's our natural environment. And let's don't forget that times of crisis are times of opportunities as well. And we need to reinvent ourselves. We need the funds. I think money is important. We need to shield ODA budgets, increase them as much as we can, and we are doing so in Spain. But we need to work together and really leverage additional resources. That's very true. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anton. That was very clear. And we'll come back to some of these points, especially on, sort of aligning, working with global public goods alongside poverty reduction across the board, as well as, the fragmented aid system that we have, and how to get a sense of, better cooperation across partners. But before we do that, let me come to Alexandre. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Michaela, and thanks to CGD organizers for this very timely event. Delighted to be taking part in it. There's both a benefit and a curse to being the last speaker on a panel. The benefit is when everybody says very interesting things, you can summarize and wrap it up. The curse is you don't have that much new to add to the conversation. A lot of what I'm going to say and what I was going to say has been raised, and I fully agree with the diagnostic of both my colleagues and a lot of the proposed solutions. So let me try to summarize that quickly, and then we can move on to the important exchange that we'll have with participants. The first thing I'll do is just spend a little bit more time on the diagnostic, actually, because yes, we agree. Largely agree with the set of very complex circumstances that we're facing. But I think it bears mention of how extraordinarily more complex the international context has become. Anton mentioned geopolitics. Absolutely. I think we are in the middle of a return to great power rivalry. And with that comes the use of development assistance by some actors, some emerging actors, as not always being in the sole interest of the recipient countries. It is being used as a tool for influence and a tool for impact for bilateral and sometimes global reasons. So we need to acknowledge that, because that is in a world where we're trying to look at every challenge as being an opportunity, that this one is definitely a big challenge that we need to contend with. Not all development models are the same. I think the impact of having a plurality of emerging donors means that the rules that we used to all agree on and know and count on don't apply necessarily in a systematic way anymore. Again, a challenge, but what it means is that there is more ODA money floating, and therefore more opportunity to have an impact on those that need it the most. Both my co-panelists talked about the layering of crises, the cumulative effect of crises. That also bears mention. There's a term I heard recently that I quite like, which is referring to the current state as one of polycrisis. I think what this polycrisis has led us to understand, and definitely it's been a bit of a shock to the system, is that we are far more integrated as countries, as economies, as systems. The world is far more integrated than we even thought it was. When you see that a completely unjustified, brutal war in Europe can have major effects on energy prices, on inflation, on food security the world over, you realize how much more integrated all systems, from energy to logistics to transportation and of course supply chains, actually are. And that's something that is not new, but I think that the conflict that Russia brought to Ukraine is a stark reminder of. So all this to say, these are not small challenges to face. But in our opinion, in the Canadian development assistance context, we do not see this as requiring a complete reinvention of the wheel. In other words, we have a set of rules, we have a backdrop, we have a framework that is the SDGs, and I would really caution the global community against trying to reinvent the SDGs. First, because they are universal and provide a great guide, not just for developing countries, but for more advanced economies to do their own economic and social development. But two, to be completely honest, is the fact that 2015 was a bit of a unique moment in time. If we tried to negotiate SDGs today, I would put a bet on the table that we would not be able to accomplish what we did in 2015. So as the saying goes, let's not throw away the baby with the bathwater. We have a great framework, and what we need to do is double down and adjust and adapt to how advancing the SDGs. Both my co-panelists mentioned the scarcity of funds, and that we're all facing that because of the situations we face domestically. It's difficult to explain to taxpayers that see their social programs, their purchasing power reduced constantly. The Canadian government has made a commitment to increase year after year its development assistance to 2030. So far, we're on track to continue doing this, and it's a struggle, but it's something we feel very strongly about. Going back to the SDGs, and this is where I'll pivot to what how Canada advances and tries to adapt. I will venture to say that not all SDGs are equal, and one that we have selected as primus inter pares is SDG 5 on gender equality. And that is kind of the anchor that drives our feminist international assistance policy. Why? Because we all know, and there's good research on this, that shows that educated women tend to marry later, have fewer children, provide better health and nutrition for their families, and ultimately earn more income than women with little or no schooling. There's a better multiplier effect, and that is also well documented in that women earning higher income will reinvest in their community and make sure that everybody benefits from it. Eliminating gender-based legal and social barriers results in women having increased access to capital, to starting businesses, to creating or securing decent jobs. And as I said, investing in their families and in their communities. And the same would extend to SRHR, when women and girls have control over decisions regarding their own bodies, maternal and child mortality decreases and families thrive. So these are all the well-documented reasons for which we have chosen to focus and double down on a feminist approach. But I want to be clear that a feminist approach is about far more than gender equality or equality between men and women. We, as I know Sweden has done, and same with Spain, also have developed or have implemented a feminist foreign policy, which is really a way of looking at everything we do in an intersectional way. It's about training our own people to develop policy in a way that measures the impact, not the input. It is based, it is human rights based, and it aims to always make sure that the most vulnerable people in an intersectional way are looked at before policy gets developed, not as an afterthought. And this is how we have now, for 4 or 5 years, conducted our policy priorities and our development assistance budgets. The two additional challenges that I will say I totally recognize, and they've been both mentioned by Anton and Karen, so I'm not going to dwell on them too much, is how we double down, how we increase financial flows, and how we make sure that recipients are in the driver's seat. Localization, and we'll all push it one step further, talk about decolonization of aid, is something that's been mentioned. I think we need to once again not challenge ourselves not to reinvent the wheel. Most of us have been working with local partners and have been empowering local partners. We did that in a rather significant way when a number of development partners invested in budget support. There are lessons to be learned there. Now, the partner there was at the government level. I think we need to do a lot more to work with grassroots organizations and give not just local ownership over implementation, but over design. The flip side of this is we as donor countries need to revise and adjust our risk tolerance and risk profile. Main challenge in investing and shifting resources to local grassroots organizations is going to be scaling up, and it's going to be accepting a slightly higher level of risk. And this is something that we need to do some homework on our side. But good work among donors is happening right now. I know that Norway and the US have been working on these localization principles, which seem universal and pretty straightforward. The challenge is going to be implementing this, and as I said, increasing our risk profile. And the last thing I'll mention is innovative finance. And I'm not going to repeat what other panelists have said, but yes, ODA will always remain fundamental to help the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable, to intervene when humanitarian situations are dire. But at the end of the day, we know how it is far from being enough, and that the vast majority of the funding in the future of the financial flows will have to come from the private sector. We've made progress in recent years in trying to devise various mechanisms. We should not get discouraged by the fact that it hasn't yet taken on. We have to double down and continue to work with the private sector, help de-risk investment projects. This is how every country that has had a successful development story has done it. Not only through government investments, but when investments are sustainable, and they're sustainable by sheer virtue of the fact that the private sector can go in and develop anything from infrastructure to social infrastructure. So the challenge is ours to continue reflecting on these, coordinating, and again revising our risk profiles to get this multiplier effect and have better impact on the ground. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. And I do want to come back to some of the points you made, especially around sort of the building of trust, but also going back to Canada's feminist international development policy. But before we do that, let me just raise a point that both Karen and Anton shared. You both said that you are, in essence, shifting your models towards, addressing the dual challenges of global public goods alongside poverty reduction. And Anton, you mentioned, focusing on the urgent as well as the important. Now, as part of the work that we've been doing, we asked development agencies whether they were actually facing difficulties from integrating global public goods into their work, and if so, what the challenges were. Now, apart from the constraints around financial and human resources to provide global public goods alongside country-focused engagement, they said, crucially, that the demand from partner countries for global public goods-focused interventions, particularly in the wake of acute development crises and needs, was not actually there. Right? So how do you then square this, with a focus on global challenges? And going back to essentially what Alexandre was talking about, which is, local ownership, localization. How do you deal with that? Let's start with Anton.
Thanks, Michaela. This is indeed a big question, but I do think there is demand for it, but we just need to listen, let's take the three, what we see as global public goods, because, as a feminist development cooperation, we also see gender equality as some sort of global public good. The question is, what do you do exactly on gender? What do you do exactly on health? What do you do exactly on climate? And I'm just back from COP27. It may be true that in terms of climate mitigation, there may be issues in demand in some countries. There may be issues in finding a bankable pipeline that our financial arms can fund. But there is a clear call for doing more on adaptation, for instance. And there is a number of some of these global public goods that are also win-wins for poverty reduction. If you work with small producers, as IFAD, for instance, by the way, chaired by a wonderful Spaniard, Álvaro Lario, like a great guy, and they are working with small producers. So they are providing economic and social opportunities for these people to be lifted away from poverty, but they are working on climate adaptation and they're working on food security, on addressing it. So we need to find these win-wins and also listen exactly to what the priorities are when it comes to health. Another good example, for many, many years, we focused on specific diseases. We, meaning the development cooperation infrastructure framework on a global scale. And we forgot perhaps health systems as a whole. And it's obvious if you look at the results of the pandemic, those countries with a stronger, more resilient, more accessible, more inclusive health systems are those that were able to cope better with the pandemic. So we need to fund again the systems, not necessarily, or not just the decision. Of course, there is great work being done by the Global Fund and other actors, but so that's what I would say we could reconcile both by listening a bit more and getting a bit more granular as to what it is that partner countries expect when it comes to gender equality, when it comes to climate, when it comes to health.
Thank you, Anton. Karen, let me ask you. I mean, when you say you're shifting your model, does this actually imply a shift in focus from countries to issues, and which in turn changes the framing about who you work with?
Good question, Michaela. We will continue work in countries and with countries, but we have for some years now focused more and more on some few issues. I would say it's a good example on looking at how we work on the African continent. We are present in 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa with bilateral cooperation. In all of them, we work with energy, clean energy, providing energy to the poorest, but also supporting the building of systems, laws or tax systems or whatever is needing in the individual countries. We do this by working with agencies or governments in different countries, but also working with civil society structures in the countries, as well as private sector partners, of course, with the guarantee instrument or in other ways. We also work with academia to support research relevant for the respective countries. So it's a bit of both, actually, countries and trying to focus more in fewer sectors. But we also work in different ways depending on the kinds of countries, because I would like to then be a bit clearer. We work in middle-income countries as well as in the poorer countries. I came back a week ago from a visit to Kosovo, Albania, and North Macedonia. In those three countries, we also there work in the environment field, energy field. But in those countries, it's much more of sort of providing expertise and exchange between our agency on energy provision in Sweden, which has a long name, working together with their peers in these countries, as well as the tax authority working with their peers. The reason for us working there is for them to be able to become members of the European Union, but it's also a global public good. So it's a bit of win-win or win-win-win, or how many wins you would like to put into that one. So we work in different ways, focus on some fewer issues than some years ago, but we will still focus on countries as development happens in countries.
Thank you, Karen. That's very clear. Alexandra, let me come to you. There was a question from the audience, which, you referred to ODA being a tool for influence and impact and so on. So the question is, how do aid agencies intend to build trust within their own countries to counter the backlash particularly against experts, in times of fiscal pressures. But secondly, how do you intend to build trust with your partner countries who are struggling, as the other speakers have said as well, to deal with multiple agencies, a entirely fragmented sort of architecture, and who may be suspicious of your motivations?
Yes, that is indeed the million-dollar question. Building trust doesn't happen overnight, and you can't look at it as starting now. And let me start with the second part of your question. We have long-standing partners relationship with the vast majority of countries where we currently operate. I was head of mission in Tanzania, where we had been working hand in hand with the government and with civil society since 1961, since the year of independence. So the trust was fundamentally already there between it was people to people trust. Yes, the government of the day can sometimes the fluctuation can happen with the government of the day on trusting over motives, but fundamentally with the partners that actually make a difference, I'd say being present, being in the field, and being as dedicated to listening to local partners is the only way to build that trust. And then being transparent about what kind of partnership we want. I think it's almost more challenging to build and rebuild that trust at home with a plurality of information, and I would dare say misinformation sources. And it can be very difficult for our own populations to have trust in public institutions. What I think we need to do a better job at is using a wider variety of, first of all, of media to get our message across, but also to use not convoluted concepts, but simple data to show how a development dollar actually benefits the country that spends it. It is not a zero-sum game. It is not a net loss. A development dollar invested in food security or agricultural systems in sub-Saharan Africa actually does have tremendous positive repercussion on the world's well-being, and including, in our case, on Canadian citizens' well-being. I think we can do a better job at explaining the relationship between the two that goes beyond the catchy tweet, and that's a challenge for us as policymakers and us as communicators.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Alexandra. Let's come to the topic of cooperation. So, we've talked about how in the wake of new and mounting global challenges, as well as the frequency and severity of them, the imperative is really for cooperation. It's becoming stronger. Now, again, we're currently working on this initiative, which aims to explore the potential for a deepening cooperation. And Karen, you mentioned your group with NORAD, trying to work better, especially with some of the newer and emerging actors. Now, some of the difficulties of cooperation that we have identified include things like, different priorities and differences in the uptake of cooperation norms and principles in essentially the development effectiveness agenda. Secondly, a lack of political appetite for cooperation. Thirdly, a lack of capacity, in terms of time, budget, and staff to seek and plan and engage in concerted cooperation. And then fourthly, the lack of representation from the non-DAC countries in international fora for development cooperation. Karen, do you recognize these challenges and any solutions how to overcome some of these obstacles?
Meet and speak. That's the only solution. Now, yeah, I recognize all four of them, and they are different, and one has to, of course, work with them in different ways. But meet, talk, and take time to actually interact and try to understand the other side. But I would like to underline maybe one thing. I do not know if you included lack of political will for cooperation, also including lack of political will in our part of the world. As I can sense from our, or sort of the rich part of the world, or whatever you would call it nowadays, an increasing will to put flags and an increasing or a lower interest rather in cooperating with others, as there's a bigger shortage of funds and money and time into some essence. And that's an increasing challenge. No, I recognize all of the challenges, and I think that the only way forward is to kind of try to look at what is actually effective tools, ways of working, partners, what is effective in reaching poverty reduction, eradication, and making it possible for people to lift themselves out of poverty. The tools are different in different settings. And the only way of finding them is actually to discuss with partners with open ears and try to really find that way forward. And that's what we are trying to do with the work with NORAD, and try to find ways forward with so-called new donors, or whatever you would call these countries nowadays, partners, newish donor partners in this setting. But I would like to take this opportunity to stress one thing that Alexandre mentioned, and one thing which is an increasing challenge, I think, for all of us, at least for Sweden and apparently also for Canada, and that's the public support. To be able to have the possibility to cooperate with different partners in our partner countries, there has to be a support in our countries for a long-term perspective on development aid. It takes time. It will take time to build a tax agency, increase the level of education or better health systems or whatever. It takes time. And with all of these multiple crises hitting back, and like the drought crisis on the Horn of Africa currently, war elsewhere, etc., it will take even longer time. And thus we have to have a good way of describing or making the public aware of what is the role of ODA. And why does it take so long time for ODA and for development cooperation to make a difference? For many years, we saw the figures, the poverty going down for many, many years. Now we're at a slightly different place. And we have to find that story today to make it actually possible for us to have these long-term development cooperation, being it with countries, CSOs, academia, private sector, or whatever. We have to have the story.
Thank you, Karin. Anton, do you recognize these challenges as well? And how are you trying to increase and enhance cooperation?
We do recognize them, but let me just say, because Alexandre mentioned something very important. It's about the SDG agenda and the 2030 agenda. We should not reinvent the wheel, and I very much agree with it. I think the roadmap and the objectives are very clear, and actually the 2030 agenda calls for this modernization of development cooperation. This is not an agenda for poor countries, an agenda for all of us. It's common challenges. Where I said that we need to reinvent ourselves is more on the how, on the delivery mechanisms, on how it is that we go about this agenda. But we do see these challenges as well. And the Spanish society, there is a strong sense of solidarity. We are a country that were middle income not that long ago. In 1981, we stopped receiving loans from multilateral institutions. And in 1986, we put together a universal health system. And I always use this example to say, when we work with middle income, upper middle income countries, there is a lot of examples that we can modestly contribute. And when it comes to gender equality, for instance, the transformations we've gone through over the last 20 years. But I think it's very important indeed that we bring along our own public opinions, because there is indeed forces, political forces in all of our countries that are not just against our policies, they are against the very idea of international development cooperation. And I think we need to appeal to values, but we need to appeal also to interests. International development cooperation is not just about solidarity. It is about solidarity, and we need to channel that solidarity. We need to do that with impact, making sure the resources deliver the most. But we need to also tell our peoples that this is about our own interests as well, that every euro spent or every dollar, every Canadian dollar spent on international development cooperation is actually a dollar spent on a better management of migration flows, tackling climate change everywhere, also down in the south, like helping some of these countries provide the environmental services they're providing to the world. When it comes to refugees, indeed, we're also increasing the amount of money we are devoted to the hosting of refugees, because we have 150,000 Ukrainian refugees that we feel very proud that they found their home at home after the illegitimate, illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But we need to appeal also to interests. And I think part of the argument is to say we are not doing anything new or different outside. We are essentially pursuing the same policies we have at home. We are decarbonizing the economy. We are helping others to decarbonize with us. We are pursuing the gender equality agenda at home. We are working with others also to make sure women are empowered everywhere. We are working on food security elsewhere, because if this crisis, and of course we're all aware that the next year is going to be very hard from this perspective, if we do not find lasting solutions to this and build more resilient, more inclusive food systems, we are going to have major global instability. So we need to present international development cooperation as an investment. I know this is difficult, but it is also a responsibility. We work with partner countries, but as managers of international development institutions, we also need to be very conscious, very aware of our own public opinions and work with them as well.
Great, thanks, Anton. Alexandra, we have 3 minutes left. Let me give you the final word on this question, in particular of garnering public support. I mean, we've been talking about development cooperation as in an investment in our shared humanity. Certainly, since we agreed the SDGs, why is it not resonating then with the public?
I think it is resonating. And I think we have an opportunity to make it resonate even more by communicating the reason and the focus of what we invest in. I think Anton just said it very well. There is an interconnectivity between our development assistance and Canada's well-being, and therefore Canadians' well-being. When you make an announcement for billions of dollars into climate financing, I think we have to give our populations a bit of credit for being able to connect the dots and see that fighting climate change does not stop at your country's borders. So that is one example. But I think if you put the emphasis on the sectors in which you invest, for us, it's climate financing, it is education, it is health systems, and right now, increasingly, food security. I think the vast majority of the population, out of compassion, would see that, yes, we need to ensure better food security for the most vulnerable populations, but also that ultimately that makes a society more secure, more sustainable, and therefore more likely to be living in security, not in conflict, to make societal progress, and ultimately be a good partner to tackle the global challenges that we have, a good partner to develop economic and trade ties, and people-to-people ties. So I think there is a connecting thread that maybe is a bit more of a challenge for us to explain to the wider public, but we need to force ourselves also not to just communicate this to civil society that operates in our sector. We know they already get it. They're not the ones we're trying to convince here, but to broaden our message. And I go back really to using data. The data is there at our disposal, and it's absolutely critical that we use this when communicating with our own domestic, wider stakeholders.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for this fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining me. Our next panel, which should have started already, will feature Clémence Landers for a focused conversation on the future of the multilateral development banks. Thank you once again to my panelists and also to the audience for this fantastic conversation.
Welcome to our audience, to our final panel of the morning on the future of the multilateral development banks. We have a fantastic group of panelists assembled here today, which is also a day that coincides with our celebration of our 20th anniversary here at the Center for Global Development. So for that reason, I'm so pleased to have Nancy Birdsall here, who is the founding mother of the Center for Global Development and someone who has consistently pushed the MDBs to be ambitious in their actions, often a woman before her time in the vision for the system. I'm also extremely pleased to have a combination of equally creative thinkers and practitioners here. Vera Songwe with us, who is the chair of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, Leslie Mastorp, who is the vice president with the New Development Bank, and Scott Morris, who's a senior fellow here at the center and also the co-director of the Sustainable Development Finance team. Before we turn to our panelists, allow me to briefly set the stage for this morning's discussion. I was almost tempted to rename this panel MDBs in the Polycrisis, because it's impossible to talk about the future of the system without reflecting on the diversity of challenges and threats the MDBs confront today and are poised to be with us in the decades ahead. We heard about the headwinds that we're facing today in the first session this morning that Charles Kennedy led. On the one hand, we have a return of many of the late 20th century crises like debt and food insecurity. The COVID pandemic, inflation, and the war in Ukraine have triggered a historic setback in poverty reduction, pushing 75 million people into extreme poverty. Today, over half of the world's poorest countries are at or at risk of debt distress. And for the first time in a decade, the world could be looking at a series of reverse graduations from the MDB hard loan windows back into their concessional windows. We heard earlier this morning about the education crisis. So any discussion of the future of the MDB system really needs to be anchored in this reality. But there is also a new generation of 21st century crises that MDBs must confront. These crises are existential for our planet. They defy national borders and threaten to catastrophically derail human progress. From climate change to preparing for the next pandemic, these global challenges will require unprecedented levels of cooperation and investment in global public goods to be contained. And it's impossible to think about mounting a meaningful global response to these challenges without a well-resourced and agile MDB system. But another reality is that over the past several decades, the MDBs have become less important sources of funding for much of the emerging world in relative terms. And this is even true for many low-income countries that have enjoyed market access, rising Chinese lending through BRI. But much of this could soon be poised to change as we exit one economic era, characterized by cheap money and big risk appetites, and enter a very changed economic landscape where global credit will likely run less hot. And all of this could suddenly make MDB financing much more attractive for many countries. But there's also still a sense that a lot of countries aren't finding what they want in the current MDB offerings. And even the promise of cheap loans doesn't compensate for this. One relative bright spot is that there's also mounting reform momentum for the first time in a very long time from major shareholders and within the MDBs themselves, who recognize that this is no longer a time for business as usual and the system must grow and it must be reformed to be more anchored in the realities of the 21st century. MDBs will now simultaneously then have to do two things. They'll have to be prepared with a big arsenal of emergency packages to tide countries through the next couple of years, which threaten to be tumultuous. But at the same time, they'll have to reorient their apparatus to focus more on investing in global public goods, which is key to making the world less vulnerable and less crisis prone. The viability of this reform agenda will hinge on how profound the consensus around the direction of travel truly is. The politics within the MDBs reflect the current state of multilateralism in global relations, so they're complex and sometimes fraught. But it's hard to envisage change within these institutions without consensus from a heterogeneous group of shareholders, with the US and China at the center, driving this agenda. And it's also true that policy ambition needs to be underpinned by financing ambition. There is no route to a better functioning global safety net without more resources. But almost across the board, donor pockets are getting shallower. IDA shareholder contributions have not grown since 2016. The recommendations of the G20 Capital Adequacy Review that could unlock hundreds of billions of funds into the system could help a great deal with this challenge, but it's not a substitute for shareholder capital, and it's especially not a substitute for grants. So that is the world that MDBs confront today. The question for today's conversation is how to steer this ship, or this tanker of a system, to port. What does a 21st century MDB look like? And is there a policy agenda that low-income countries, emerging markets, China, and the G7 can all get behind? So before I turn to the panelists to answer this question, just one piece of housekeeping, because we want to hear from our audience. If you have questions for our panelists, please submit them to events@cgd.org or tweet them at CGDDev #CGDTalks, or submit your comments via YouTube. So let me turn first to Nancy Birdsall. Nancy, I'd love it if you could help steer this conversation. And if I could ask you to reflect a bit on today's context and how you think about the system and the reforms you would advocate for. You've been such an early advocate for the reorientation of the system towards global public goods. In 2016, you led a landmark CGD report with Scott Morris that proposed creating a new window at the World Bank to fund GPGs. Today, the World Bank shareholders have tasked the World Bank with developing a new evolution roadmap to set out a vision for an institution that is more readily able to engage on global challenges. What is your wish list? What is your evolution roadmap, not just for the World Bank, but for the entire MDB system look like? Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Clémence. What an excellent introduction you gave all of us. And thank you for your reference to the 2016 report. I thought what I would do today is focus on global public goods. As your introduction noted, there are many challenges right now, but I want to just focus on global public goods because the MDB system has not been responsive. And we have been talking in one way or another in the development community about global public goods for over a decade, including, of course, climate, pandemic, preparedness and response, anti-malarial resistance or antibiotic resistance. So let me focus right now on global public goods and especially put in your minds climate. As you said, it's the existential crisis. And I think we are at a moment when finally it might be possible to really push on something sensible and big in terms of money at the World Bank to start, but in a way that makes clear that the other MDBs should be fully engaged and indeed with some sort of a governance setup, say at the World Bank, that ensures the sharing of jointly raised resources. So let me start by saying three things. Well, no, first, now is the time. Now is the moment. And I think the reason for that, in my mind, I mean, I live in the US, I read the papers here. The last couple of years, more and more Americans have come to the realization that that the climate problem is an existential problem. And it's because of the crises here, the natural disasters, the floods, the wildfires. They haven't come to the realization that this is a global problem. They don't listen to NPR and BBC and so on. But it matters in the US because the US is the biggest single shareholder at many of the MDBs, and because traditionally the US has taken leadership. So I think we have to keep in mind when we talk about the MDBs that we're talking to the shareholders. We're not talking to the bureaucracies. So amongst those shareholders, we have to keep in mind the big ones, especially the US. We cannot ignore China. We cannot ignore India, et cetera, on what's needed. The first thing that's needed is money, as you said, resources. And US spending and European spending to help the Ukrainians in their war with Russia demonstrates that there is money there. So what is missing maybe is the will to do it. And we have good ideas on the table from the development community, including at the African Development Bank, the ideas about using SDR reallocations to create the net funds that meet the standards of the IMF as asset, blah, blah, blah. So, but the big issue is definitely money. And here I think what we need is more activism focused on money at the MDBs. We have to take the money issue out of the think tank community and put it, I keep thinking back to the age of Jubilee in the 2000s and early 2000s when it was the activists on debt that made a difference. What should be done exactly, as you referred to, Clémence, it's not complicated. My own view is, as we suggested in that 2016 report, as I did with Scott Morris, it's a matter of capital, putting capital first at the World Bank because it is the World Bank, and having that capital generate income to do to do subsidies in World Bank and other MDB operations to make sure that the costs, I mean, I have two examples in my mind, campaigns. In India, the MDBs should be making it easy for the Indians to get out of coal into natural gas or into renewables. How do they do that? They have to cover the costs in a world where, least cost still looks to the private sector as though it's not renewables, right? Or it's not transition to natural gas. So there has to be subsidies to what is already there. There has to be the leverage of the private sector resources, but that can only come when the additional costs in market terms that have to cover the positive externalities. Most listeners will have some familiarity with this concept. I think it was a breakthrough that Janet Yellen mentioned it in her speech at the Center for Global Development just a few weeks ago during the meetings. Do I have a little more time?
You do, Nancy.
I'm okay. So it's rich shareholder money. And let me say again, it may be the moment in the US. There is my concern would be how to bring in the leadership of the World Bank to do a kind of campaign on this issue. It's a little bit awkward right now because the leadership at the World Bank is David Malpass, who was appointed during the Trump administration. So I think the other shareholders of the rich world need to be urging the Biden administration to think hard with Malpass or with a different leader how to get the World Bank lined up to do something sensible, which is to raise at least, we said in the 2016 report, enough capital to fund over time $10 billion a year in subsidies, which would be attached to MDB, World Bank and other MDB operations in agriculture, in energy, and so on. So it's not complicated, but we should be emphasizing it is about subsidies. We can have discussions about how this issue is related to poverty reduction. That's already happening. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. The subsidies have to be associated with operations that have usually private sector investment, especially if we're talking about energy. I think a lot of discussion is required among the banks, the MDBs, about starting, that would be, my advice, let the activists push for it at the World Bank because it is the World Bank. But the issue of how this new window, like an IDA window, should be governed also should be on the agenda. And how it would use the resources that are put there in a manner that is in coordination with the other MDBs. Here, I think it's very interesting to think about the new development bank and the AIIB playing a role in moving ahead with this kind of arrangement. One way would be to just set it up at one of those banks, but that is not as good in the medium term as those banks sharing somehow in the discussion and ensuring that their shareholders have a role in the governance of this new window. And for those listening who don't understand all of this, it's worth realizing that the governance of the concessional fund, IDA, at the World Bank is not the same as the governance of the bank as a whole, or of the capital window, or the hard window. So everything about this can be thought through and should be thought through in the context of even today's discussion as a starting point. Let me stop and end by a plea to any people who are in the activist community worldwide. Think of the folks at Sharm el-Sheikh. They're not referring to the potential of the multilateral development bank system to come to the world's rescue. That should be on our agenda as the kind of insiders in the system who understand the multilateral banks. We have to find a way to energize and work with, or encourage the activists to work without us, and to pound on the table and go to the streets at every MDB meeting and to talk about this issue and push for it in the context of each MDB's new round of recapitalizations. Let me stop there and hear from the others. Thanks, Clémence.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a really wonderful way to start the conversation and such an interesting strategic perspective on your part. And it actually blends really nicely with where I wanted to go next. And I wanted to turn to Vera, who's actually just returning from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh and can talk a little bit about, maybe a little bit more where the climate politics, which have also gotten very complicated. And one of the dominant themes that often comes out of these conversations in the World Bank, and many of the MDBs are at the center of this, is that many of the poor countries are feeling that there's a real double standard when it comes to the Western countries in particular, climate and energy policies. And there's a simultaneous sense that much of the developed world is kicking away the development ladder and insufficiently helping defray the cost of climate change for the poorest countries. So Vera, you just put out a landmark report on finance for climate action. And I thought maybe I could ask you to speak a little bit more about what you see as the MDB role in driving some of this consensus that Nancy Birdsall was talking around politics of climate? And how do you think the MDB system should be approaching climate financing differently than it is today?
Thank you, Clémence. First of all, let me start by congratulating Nancy, of course, and saying what an honor and a pleasure it is to be on this panel with her and everybody else, Leslie and the rest, of course, Scott. We've all worked together on this, and Masood, who now is running CGD. Now, I think this is a very important and interesting conversation from two perspectives. One is, as Nancy said so well, the MDBs, when we talk about MDB reform, I think we need to be very clear that MDB reform comes from the 7, heads of the international community, and not the sort of not necessary. I would say 50% is the shareholders and 50% is maybe the management and the system. Let me start with what the shareholders have to do. First of all, we need a capital increase in the MDBs. There is no way we can do everything that is being asked of the MDBs with the same amount of financing. The problems, as you said in the beginning, have tripled since COVID. If you look at Africa, for example, first recession in 25 years, now we have inflation, which is hitting us. Of course, we have the war in Ukraine, which is coming. We had COVID. It's impossible, I think, under the same balance sheet to see how the MDBs can deal with all of these different crises. In our report, and this is a second important point of the MDBs, and I'm very happy, again, as Nancy said, that Secretary Yellen at the CGD during the fall meetings mentioned this, is we need to see climate change and the climate crisis and development in general, the search for prosperity in emerging markets as one thing. We can no longer have sort of, what we see in some MDBs, a climate report of a particular country and then the development report somewhere else. This have to be the same. And our report on finance for climate action actually says that the climate crisis is a development crisis. So we need to look at it in a holistic fashion. The second thing that we're looking for, of course, is something that you look for inside the MDBs. It's maybe seeing how the MDBs can do more and better with the balance sheet they have. We have a lot of conversations today around the MDBs trying to keep a AAA rating. We believe, and there is a report that is going to be discussed in Bali this week, that says actually the MDBs can do a lot more and still keep their AAA rating. But essentially, the MDBs were created to be risk-taking animals. And so there is an antithesis between trying to keep your AAA rating and making sure that those countries, what we should be doing is trying to make sure that countries can get to better credit rating, right? And so that they can have more access to market capital. And our report says we need to increase the resources of the MDBs from 60 billion to 180 billion so we can leverage more the private sector, which needs also to triple its investment in emerging markets to ensure that we can fight the climate crisis. Now, the big thing that was at COP27, and we're still discussing it, is the whole issue of loss and damage, adaptation, and how we finance that. Of course, we have to finance that, as Nancy said, through additional subsidies, through additional capital that comes in. It's impossible to expect developing countries to finance loss and damage and adaptation on their own. And so our report talks about MDBs and MDB capital, increasing it by threefolds from 60 billion to 180 billion. But we also need pure concessional grant funding, which is the either window. This is now sort of inside the Beltway conversation, but this is the sort of the fund for the poorest and the World Bank, and the need to also triple the resources that are going to go to that fund, grant capital through the voluntary carbon markets. Big discussions at COP around, voluntary carbon markets. We launched a new program called the African Carbon Markets Initiative to see how Africa can garner more resources from that. Of course, ODA, the private sector, and philanthropy, can we do more so that we can actually begin to respond to some of these adaptation conversations as we go forward? And then natural capital is an important part of the conversation we'll talk about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vera. And you spoke a lot about the need for more financing. And I think that's an interesting, very important point, and it pivots nicely to what I wanted to ask Leslie. And I think the key point around the AAA is quite interesting. And for Leslie, do you think that the MDBs have the right balance between prudent and efficient capital management? And in particular, we've already alluded to it a little bit today, but the G20 recently commissioned a capital adequacy review that has been since released and has put forward a series of pragmatic reforms that could potentially together increase the financial firepower of the MDB system by hundreds of billions. So what do you think about that report? How does the new development bank think about that report? What elements of the agenda do you plan to take forward? And more broadly, do you think that shareholders, what do you think shareholders should be telling MDBs right now to align their finance priorities with their risk tolerance more in a more strategic way?
Thank you very much, Clemens, for the opportunity, and do indicate if at any stage the reception is not too good so that I can do my backup dial back in. Let me also compliment CGD for the leadership you are providing in the papers you have written on the area of financing global public goods. From a new development bank perspective, we are very, very encouraged by the G20, the build-up towards the report of the Eminent Persons Group, and the idea, for example, that MDBs have underutilized the callable capital as an instrument within their balance sheet. The idea that preferred credit is a unique feature of MDBs is all under the idea that we need to our balance sheets. I mean, I would argue that there's been significant enhancements around how MDBs look at their balance sheet. MCPP, institutional investor capital. In 2012 and 2015, as you know, after the Antalya G20 meetings, the call was made by shareholders for MDBs to optimize their balance sheets. MDBs then started to experiment with exposure exchange agreements, which was really a way to reduce their concentration risk. But a lot of these things were done, I would say, tinkering in sort of bit by bit in an incremental fashion. What provide is a way for us to tackle it much more holistically. And once these recommendations are hopefully endorsed by the G20, it will take us forward in a much. What I would like to make is that coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh in the last 2 days, I think that emerging markets, if there's one takeaway for me from the meetings over the last few days, it's this whole new focus on the just transition. And it is, just happened to be the case that the G20 over the next couple of years will be rooted in emerging. And I think this theme is going to continue, that emerging markets and the concerns of the borrowing countries will become center stage. In short, what I'm suggesting to you, and this point has already been made by Vera and Nancy very eloquently, that MDBs have been quite risk averse. In order for us to preserve our AAA rating, it has led to a risk aversion. And we are calling for that change in culture, change in mindset. And it is very important that the World Bank, as, if you like, first amongst equals, to give leadership to this. So we do expect the World Bank to play that leadership role in order for us to make more fundamental reforms going forward. What is required, as you have touched on, is for us to go beyond this kind of, once every few years, we look at the system and rather ask the more fundamental question whether the system is fit for purpose. And it's indeed a question that was posed very prominently in the 2016 report that you have pioneered. In short, what I'm saying is that these ideas are not new about what needs to be done. It's just that the culture is one of risk aversion, and we have been slow moving to implement it. More decisive leadership is required, and the United States, as a leading shareholder, has a critical role to play. I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie. Scott, China's already come up a little bit today, but I wanted to focus a little bit more on that with you. China's obviously increasingly become an influential voice and source of funds at the MDBs. They're the third largest shareholder at the IBRD, and their contributions to IDA have really increased quite dramatically over recent years. Can I ask you maybe to think and or reflect a little bit for us on how you see China's role and priorities within the system? How is that changing? How has that changed over time? And then maybe a little bit more broadly, how do you think the current state of U.S.-China relations affects China's view of the system and the ability to really implement some of these big ambitious reforms that we've been talking about today?
Well, thank you, Clemence. Frankly, I'm having so much fun listening to others. I'm reluctant to talk, but let me try to answer your question. I will say I was struck, I mean, both in your framing, and Nancy referred at one point to the U.S. and China being at the center, I think I'm paraphrasing, of the system. What's striking to me, I very much agree with that characterization. On the other hand, it's also a controversial characterization today. And I think, so I want to try to convey a couple of points when it comes to China's position in the MDBs today, and then in particular, U.S. attitudes toward that position, because we are in a strikingly different place today than certainly we were a decade ago. And maybe to start, I will answer your question with my own question, which is, will the MDBs continue to be a protected space for cooperation at a time when bilateral relationships have deteriorated so much? And I pose that not rhetorically. I think it's an important question. I don't have an answer to it. So let me start, if we go back a decade, and let's think about where China was, and I'll focus on the World Bank in particular, and then where the U.S. was in its relationship with China. So this was a time when China's economy had already grown quite rapidly in a way that the rules of the international financial institutions say that it should become a greater shareholder by an agreed formula. At that time, it was really the U.S. more than any other country that played the role of champion for China's increased position at the World Bank. And it did so not simply to be friendly to China in a bilateral relationship, but frankly, in support of the underlying principle of the institution as to how the shareholding arrangement should work. Beyond that, I think the U.S. also wanted to see China play a larger role as a donor to IDA and was fairly vocal about that. And beyond that, you really didn't hear much in the way of concerns or complaints from U.S. officials, even as China was a large and even dominant borrower from the institution. There, maybe a little bit of grumbling, but it didn't feature prominently in U.S. Views at the time. For its part, China, and I think this is important to emphasize, we should appreciate how importantly China takes not just its position in the MDBs, but it's more generally its relationship with these institutions, and particularly the World Bank. Throughout the opening up period, you hear from leading Chinese officials consistently that they have placed tremendous value on advice they've received from the bank, intellectual leadership, certainly the financing relationship, although that alone, it wasn't terribly meaningful except as a delivery mechanism. Certainly a decade ago, and it continues to this day, China has placed a lot of value on the World Bank and the other MDBs. What has certainly changed, coming back to the bilateral relationship, we all know the degree to which there's been this deterioration and a shift on both sides of the relationship, not just U.S. and China, but U.S. alongside, let's say, the G7 countries and China. So much so that if we put it in the context of the World Bank and think about, well, where do we see U.S. attitudes today? So let's start with the question of shareholding. It is frankly inconceivable to me in the current moment to imagine that the U.S. would play the kind of role as champion of China's greater shareholding that they did a decade ago. And this is at a moment where the World Bank tells us, according to the formula, China is at half the level of shareholding that it should be today. So obviously, this gulf has widened significantly over time, but there really are no political prospects for dealing with it at the moment. Add to that list in terms of U.S. views, a growing concern about China's borrowing over the last decade, to the degree that we actually now have essentially soft commitments that has China borrowing dramatically less across the MDBs, and that's not likely to change. You have some concerns about the commercial benefits China or Chinese firms have enjoyed through procurement arrangements at the MDBs. I think that's an increasing area of focus. And then perhaps, I think most striking to me in my own inability to answer the question is, let's imagine that China continued on this trajectory as an IDA donor, where it's made very rapid increases in its contributions. Let's imagine they continued in that way, such that they were, say, the second, third, fourth largest IDA donor in subsequent rounds. A decade ago, I would have said the U.S. and other leading donors would have clearly embraced that as a matter of burden sharing, and this was an appropriate role for China. Today, I'm not so sure. Would it be embraced, or would it be viewed with some degree of suspicion about, China's intentions, what it would mean for governance in the system? So all of these things suggest, we are facing a real dilemma today when it comes to the leading shareholders in the system. I think it is, and that dilemma is probably best encapsulated on this question of new capital for the MDBs. I think all the other panelists have invoked this, and I very much agree that it has to be high on the agenda. It is in the tradition of these capital increases at the World Bank. They are also opportunities to revisit the shareholding power question. And I think we are facing what is a very significant barrier in how to even approach a capital increase when we face this really deadlock around China's position. So I think it's a question that is best posed to both sides of the conflict. When it comes to the U.S. and allies, particularly Japan, currently the number 2 IBRD shareholder, can they embrace even a conversation around new capital that in a traditional way also revisits relative shareholding in a way that clearly would benefit China? And perhaps a question posed to China is, in the absence of that, China has been an advocate for new capital, consistently so in recent years. Would they embrace new capital at the World Bank without any change in the shareholding arrangement? Or do they, would they in fact be dug in on this question? I think we need answers from these leading shareholders on these kinds of questions if we are going to move forward on resourcing the institutions appropriately to meet all the challenges they face today. So let me stop there on the China question.
Thank you, Scott. A very interesting series of dilemmas that you raise, and maybe one other dilemma that has often come up with China is the debt dilemma. And Vera, I wanted maybe to turn to you, because you've been in particular, you've been very focused on how to help African issuers maintain market access. Today, many African issuers are cut off from capital markets and are facing very real debt challenges. And this is especially dramatic in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a real rollover risk with about almost $40 billion in Eurobonds coming due over the next 2 years. What do you think, if anything, MDBs can do to help with this dichotomy?
Thanks again, and very good questions from Scott, as always. Listen, I think, and this a little bit picks up maybe from what Scott said, you know, over time, what we have seen is a lot of the African countries and what used to be called low-income countries have actually moved into the middle-income category, right? In the case of the continent, of course, we've moved also to borrowing from the MDBs, but also from China. Part of it because the MDBs are not giving us enough of the resources that we need. And so you see with initiatives like the BRI across the globe from Southeast Asia to Africa to Latin America, a lot more exposure to China, but also a lot more exposure to the market. So 40% of Africa's debt today is on the markets with Eurobonds and things like that. But what we also see then is we have a perceptions risk and a liquidity risk, right? And this is very important because what ends up being called generally indebtedness, sometimes it's just a liquidity problem where we need to be able to see how we can shore up some of these countries. And we saw the IMF do that fantastically well during the beginning of the COVID crisis, where countries did have sort of bullet payments coming up. And what they had was long-term, you know, sustainable macro frameworks, but didn't have the liquidity to pay for a particular bullet issuance. And we need to manage, I think, the conversation between sort of indebtedness, insolvency, and liquidity. And the MDBs can play a role there. Particularly, and I go back, we haven't all mentioned it, but I think it's in all of us, our minds, is the SDRs, right? If we look at climate finance and development finance as one, then, and I think that we have been calling for it in our report with honor to have to write the report with Nick Stern and Amar Bhattacharya, you know, talking about maybe a climate issuance of SDRs. And Masood and Nancy Lee at CGD have also talked about this. Mark Plant has written a lot about. We need to be able to figure out, you know, the SDRs, when they were initially created, they had to be issued every 5 years, actually, if there was a macroeconomic shock in the global system. I think, you know, if you look around, we have, you know, the polycrisis, as you call it at CGD, and we wonder why we are not having another issuance of SDRs, and even SDRs issued along the lines of not, you know, country classification, but country exposure to the risk that we have. And that will provide additional liquidity for countries to be able to manage this short-term risk, which is turning into a long-term sort of indebtedness crisis. I also believe that the MDBs need to change their instruments so that they can respond to this kinds of sort of short-term versus long-term indebtedness versus liquidity conversations. We came up 2 years ago with an idea called the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, which we're working on. And the idea was to say, for a lot of the Eurobonds that are issued by, you know, emerging market economies and Africa in particular, there is no secondary capital market. So what has happened is also that we have seen a mismatch between the rapid development of a lot of these countries and the development or the support by MDBs to create the institutions that will allow them access to capital in a way that works for development. And so creating additional sort of market instruments for these countries is particularly important. What we have created is a repurchase market. It's not the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. Essentially, it's a repurchase market. If PIMCO, Amundi, or any one of these institutions buys Eurobonds from Africa, they can actually go to a repurchase window and exchange that security for more liquidity. This is what the liquidity question is about, so that they can come back to the market. That does three things for us. One, it allows these institutions to provide us with longer term financing. The IMF has done something fantastic. They've just opened a long-term financing RSC3 20 to 30 year window, 10-year maturities. This is what we need more of. And so essentially, I think one of the things that MDBs could do is change their sort of set of instruments as countries mature, as countries graduate into a sort of new liquidity and resource demands. Can we change those instruments that we have for them so that they can actually access markets, leverage the private sector more importantly, because this is where we will get the trillions. The whole conversation, all these conversations we're having today is about how to get from billions to trillions. Our report says we need $1 trillion in external financing by 2030 to be able to deal with the climate and development crisis. How do you do it? It's by getting more liquidity in an environment that is more transparent, in an environment that has the credibility, the monitoring capacity, that where data is available so that you can know what the resources are actually doing for who. And finally, I think that one of the things we need to do as we talk about debt is also to see how the MDBs can work together better so that there is more transparency in sort of cost of debt, access to debt, and by the time they get to the private sector markets, the MDBs have taken the first loss. They've taken sort of provided the guarantees that allow for a reduction in the cost of capital when we get to the markets. I think these are the kinds of sort of conversations that we believe additional capital increase by our shareholders, particularly for the World Bank, will help do. So it will take us away from this conversation on debt to a conversation on investment. And this is what we were talking about in Sham. How can we make sure that we, invest in more solar panels, invest in better cooking capacities for women in the developing countries, invest in health in a way that is affordable and accessible to all.
Thank you, Vera. And conversation about investment and mobilization, you're reading the mind of many of our viewers, and we're getting several audience questions right now, and they're all around MDB's role in private capital mobilization. So Leslie, and maybe Vera, I can ask you to then comment as well. Let me just synthesize some of these questions. MDB seems that private capital mobilization has been a white whale for many of the MDBs. A lot of our audience members are saying that they're seeing a real disconnect between growing private sector interest in ESG investments and really what is a fairly limited track record from the MDBs on mobilization. What are the MDBs getting right? What are they getting wrong in this arena? One of our viewers even asks, is billions to trillions dead? Leslie, over to you. And then Vera, I would love to hear you supplement that.
Thank you very much, Clemens. I hope you can, I'm a bit more audible now, but maybe just to start off by saying that the process of situating mobilization of capital right at the center of the MDB's agenda started about a decade ago. Unfortunately, and the audience members are absolutely spot on. The progress has been slow, have been incremental, but we have not been able to achieve scale. So the biggest challenge facing us today is scale. As I said, way back in 2012, 2013, the IFC EBRD managed to crowd in significant amounts of institutional investor capital from the likes of Amundi, Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and these large institutional asset managers who realized that there's significant scope and opportunity in the sustainable infrastructure domain. So I think there is an acceptance today within the MDB world that we need to move away from growing our own balance sheets to playing much more of a catalytic role. Catalytic role meaning that we leverage and use our capital in more imaginative ways, as Vera has highlighted, for example, taking on first loss guarantee structures. In fact, using guarantees as an instrument more, and in this regard, MIGA, which is within the World Bank, can play a much bigger role in the MDB system as a whole. Guarantees, by the way, Clemens, only constitutes 5% as an instrument within the MDB system. However, it mobilizes more than 45% of the private sector capital. What I'm suggesting, therefore, is that there is still significant scope to expand the use of guarantees as an instrument for mobilization. What I was trying to say earlier on, just to recap, is that there's been this risk aversion culture that is cemented within the MDB world because we have been so obsessed, rightly so, with maintaining our AAA credit rating, but at the same time, we did not go back to first principles and ask some of the basic elementary questions, which is what the G20 panel on capital adequacy have actually done. So I think we're going to be moving forward significantly when this report is endorsed, because shareholders, this is the power of the G20, it's not a decision-making body, but it coalesces the views of shareholders. And the final point I'd like to make here is that we do need leadership within the MDB community, because MDB as a system, and I think either Nancy or Vera or Scott made reference to it, MDBs really function as individual enterprises. We need to look for the complementarities of the system, and for that you need leadership, you need champions. And the World Bank, which is right up there as the largest, if you like, needs to be called upon to play a much more decisive role, as Janet Yellen has called for when she addressed CGD a week before the annual meetings. In short, what I'm saying is that the only way to scale development finance is to succeed in the mobilization effort. And the private sector, and my final comment I'd like to make is the private sector have indeed come to the party, Clemens. If you look at the conversations now within your big institutional investor community, they talk about climate risk being investment risk. It is right at the top of the agenda. It is no longer a fringe subject, and climate finance has now become mainstream. So we've got a much better potential and platform now to accelerate the mobilization of private sector capital. And what will also help in 2023 is the work that the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has now been established, they're capacitating themselves. They will begin to put in place standardized, globally consistent metrics, which will take ESG to another level. So 2023, in my view, does have the potential to unleash further the additional firepower of MDBs.
Thank you, Leslie. Elvira, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that provocative question?
Maybe very quickly. I think there is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. These are the trillions. So just to sort of answer the question of shall we see the trillions exist. And I think the reason why Nancy, myself, Leslie, Scott, we're all talking a little bit about where to go, how can we leverage concessional resources to ensure that we get the trillions. And the conversation we're all having here today is a simple, if you look at sort of the process as a pipeline process, right? ODA grants are the first thing we've all heard about, difficulty in finding bankable projects, the need to bring together sort of policy reform in countries. All of these are not sort of adjustable rate of return type of activities. So there you need grant financing, you need ODA money, and then maybe you need some concessional money to sort of kickstart the process. Once you have that, then you can get the private sector coming in with those billions and those trillions. And we've seen it in Namibia, for example, already. We have the private sector coming into the tune of 9.4 billion to invest in a hydrogen project, right? We have 4-point-something billion in Egypt, again on a solar power project. So the trillions will come. But I think something that maybe we are also missing in the conversation is, yes, MDBs and financing to MDBs and the ODA, particularly important, but the policy environment is probably maybe even more important sometimes than, the MDB reforms, because the MDBs can come and support a policy environment that is adequate, that can crowd in financing. But it is very important, and I just wanted to make this point, that for us to get from the billions to the trillions, we are going to need to get a policy environment that is adequate, that can crowd in the financing. We're seeing this, and the good thing is that we're seeing this in Senegal, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Kenya, and we see some of it in South Africa as South Africa begins to push, and we talked about it a lot at the COP, with its energy sector reform in ESCOM. We've talked about this for so long. Finally, there is a plan, there is reform. The World Bank has come in with $500 million as the kind of concessional money that we've seen philanthropy come in under the GAP sort of alliance to begin to see whether we can actually get to where we need to get to. Now South Africa needs to push in with more of the reforms so that more of the private sector will come in. But there is a private sector out there with trillions of dollars looking to invest in renewable development projects if the policy environment is right. I just wanted to sort of answer the trillions must come with policy from the sort of government side and the country ownership.
So we've talked about the trillions from the private sector. Let's maybe one last question for Scott. We can reflect on where are the billions coming from the public sector. In particular, the concessional windows at the MDBs, the IDA, the International Development Association at the World Bank, the African Fund at the African Development Bank have been relative bright spots throughout COVID. They were really able to increase their lending quite significantly. But their models do really rely very heavily on regular donor infusion. And in recent years, we've seen the African Development Fund get quite a bit smaller. IDA's only been able to grow because of its hefty reflows and market access, not because of growing donor contributions. Scott, maybe I could ask you to just reflect a little bit on how you see the future of these windows.
Yeah, thanks. And I agree, they do face financing challenges going forward. Also agree that they have, in a sense, been a bright spot, so much so that I would actually argue, in a sense, if we look at the World Bank, it is IDA that is the future of the institution, not IBRD. And that, that's a strange thing to say if we think in a traditional way about these financing models. So, IDA was created to better help countries with low per capita incomes, low creditworthiness, and offer them heavily subsidized financing terms, with an understanding that as countries progress, they would, this word graduation has been invoked a number of times, they would graduate into IBRD. So one would imagine over time, more countries as IBRD countries, fewer as IDA, and the relative resource shift would reflect that. But enter this global public goods agenda and all the characteristics I think Nancy outlined at the outset, and IDA starts to look a lot more attractive than IBRD. And in a sense, we can say that IDA can do everything IBRD does and more. And literally so, IDA has now adopted IBRD's financing model. It issues its own debt in markets and finances a portion of its IDA countries directly through that mechanism on less concessional terms. That all happens alongside the traditional donor-dependent, heavily subsidized financing model. So putting them together, you have a full range of potential financing, everything from direct grants to much less concessional terms. Add to that IDA also has the ability to finance non-sovereign activities, unlike the IBRD. So in a sense, this is the most flexible arm of the institution. And even if we don't literally mean that IDA should be the GPG centered window or part of the institution, it is certainly the area we should be scrutinizing and trying to understand better in terms of how do we provide a range of potential financing terms to a range of actors in this space. And again, so I think this is where we could be doing a lot more thinking about that model of the institution, even as we continue to talk about things like capital increases and other balance sheet measures in the hard loan windows going forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Scott. And thanks for ending on an optimistic note. I think this was an incredible whirlwind tour d'horizon of the system. And I think it was both realistic, but actually quite optimistic in many ways. So Nancy, if I could just give you the last word, maybe in a minute or so, how are you thinking differently 45 minutes into this conversation about the system, and what are some of the key takeaways that you have from this conversation? And you're on mute.
I agree. It's very nice to think that we are ending on an optimistic note. So let me just say a few things about what others said as a kind of summary. First, Leslie made the point that there's a AAA culture still in the MDBs, which reminded me of the attitude of the Treasury and the Inter-American Development Bank when I was there, which was basically not to be too many basis points more expensive than the World Bank. That was a long time ago. I think that progress is being made, certainly at the Inter-American Development Bank, among others. So I like that point a lot. It goes to the issues of the capital adequacy report, of course. The trillions, I liked a lot of what Vera was saying about a new way of to me, a kind of new way. I learned a lot, a new way of thinking about the trillions, including the much more emphasis, as in the capital adequacy report, on guarantees of the MDBs. I do want to say that I am very impressed increasingly with leadership from Africa on so many issues, including at the African Development Bank, but Africa in general. The reality that Africa is moving toward and finalizing an incredibly interesting regional trade agreement. It's already started, but it's still working on details. And much of what Vera said on other issues is just reflected it's the positive side of what's called the decolonization effort. I think it's very important the point that Scott made about IDA at the end. It was a little harsh to hear from Scott about the China situation and where it might go in the multilateral development banks. But I think there's room for a breakthrough there. But the other thing Scott said that's important is that IDA could become a more flexible instrument. It has shown already that it can become a more flexible instrument. And so I guess I still leave with the sense that we need much more emphasis, much more push, much more alliances with the activist community on the existential crisis of climate and of future pandemics, among several other things. So what a fantastic panel. I learned a lot. Thank you to each of you. And thank you, Clémence.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I like to end it on room for a breakthrough, which I think is exactly the right place to end it. And I'd like to invite our special guest, Masoud Ahmed, who's here to come back in and close out our 3-day session. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Clémence. And let me just start by saying what Nancy said at the end. What a fantastic panel. And I'm going to broaden that out and say, what a fantastic set of 3 panels we've had. So first of all, thanks to you, Clem, thanks to Michaela, thanks to Charles for the excellent job you all did in moderating it, and thanks to all of the panelists. And I'm not going to try to build on the summary that Nancy just gave of the last panel, but except to say just one thing, which is I was listening to all 3 panels, and there are a set of technical solutions, ideas, questions that were put up. But very quickly, and a lot of the conversation moved from the technical to the discussion of the politics, the political economy, the geopolitics, the need to build trust within countries to ensure that people understood the purpose of international cooperation and how it was changing, and the need to build alliances with people across bodies and groups which haven't traditionally thought of themselves as allies on some of these issues. And so I do feel that perhaps there's a lesson in there also for think tanks like us as we go forward. Do we also need to think harder about the extent to which our work can go beyond the technical to looking at some of those issues of the building alliances, the politics, and how we do that in a way that is constructive and rigorous and based on evidence and also offers practical solutions. So let me just say thanks to all of you, and thanks to everyone who's spent time participating by watching these 3 panels and the conversation that Minouche, Shafiq, and I had at the beginning to start it off. So thanks again.